Ma'am, he's been staring at what looks like some kind of diagram. Security layouts, maybe. I don't feel safe with him up there." The words came out low and breathless, wrapped in the particular tone of a woman who had already decided what she was looking at before she opened her mouth. Margaret Ashworth, Peggy to everyone who thought they knew her, leaned across the narrow armrest of seat 4B and pressed her lips close to the flight attendant's ear. Her pearls swayed forward as she did it. Her eyes stayed locked on the back of the gray hoodie 2 rows ahead. The words weren't a cry for help. They weren't even really a question. They were a match. And Diane Crowley had been waiting her entire 18-year career for someone to hand her exactly this kind of excuse. Diane listened with the focused attention of a woman taking inventory. She nodded once slowly, the practiced nod of someone performing concern. Then she straightened, smoothed the front of her navy uniform jacket, and looked toward seat 2A with the expression of a woman who had already rendered her verdict. What neither of them knew, what not one of the 12 passengers in that first-class cabin knew, was that the man sitting in seat 2A had signed the paperwork that made every uniform on that aircraft his property exactly 72 hours earlier. That the leather duffel stowed above his head had been carried into more boardrooms than either of them would ever see in their lifetimes. That the tablet resting on his knee, the one with the diagrams that had so thoroughly alarmed Peggy Ashworth, contained the architectural plans for a terminal expansion that his company was funding. And that in less than 4 hours, every person who had touched this moment, every person who had made a choice in the next 60 minutes, would understand with complete and irreversible clarity exactly what they had done. Outside, Portland rain hammered the massive glass walls of Portland International Airport in long, heavy sheets. The concourse lights blurred in the wet dark. At Gate C7 Flight 219 to Chicago sat fully boarded, door still open, the engines not yet alive. The first-class cabin held 12 passengers. 11 of them had been welcomed aboard with a smile, offered a pre-departure beverage, and left completely alone. One had not. He had boarded 12 minutes ago, quietly, without ceremony, without the assistant or the entourage or the Tom Ford suit that would have made everything immediately legible to people like Diane Crowley. He had smiled at the gate agent. He had found his seat. He had stowed his bag and pulled out his tablet and begun reviewing the Denver expansion schematics because that was what he did. He worked constantly with the focused hunger of a man who had built everything he owned from nothing and intended to build more. He had not spoken to anyone. He had not moved from his seat. He had not by any reasonable definition done a single thing wrong. But Peggy Ashworth had looked at him. At the hoodie, the sneakers, the dark skin, the seat number that her mind told her didn't add up. And she had reached a conclusion as fast and as certain as a door slamming shut. And Diane Crowley, standing in the galley with Peggy's words still warm in her ear, had done exactly the same thing. They exchanged a look. Peggy from her seat, Diane from the galley entrance. The brief, charged look of two people who believe they are on the same side of something important. Diane gave a small nod. Peggy settled back. She adjusted her pearls and picked up her sparkling water with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has done her civic duty. In seat 1C, a silver-haired man named James Whitfield had already lowered his paperback. He was 67 years old. He had spent 22 years as a federal judge in the Oregon District Court. He had seen from the elevated vantage point of the bench precisely what a prejudgment looked like in real time, the speed of it, the confidence of it, the way it wore the costume of reason while being nothing of the sort. He watched Diane disappear behind the galley curtain. He watched Peggy take another self-satisfied sip. He looked toward seat 2A, where the man in the gray hoodie was reading his tablet with complete unhurried calm. He set his paper back face down on his knee. And the crew of Flight 219, with the perfect oblivious confidence of people who have never once been held accountable for anything, began to dismantle their own careers, one decision at a time. No Tom Ford suit, no Rolex on his wrist, no assistant trailing 3 steps behind him with a leather portfolio and a phone already dialed. Marcus Durrell Webb, 44, walked through Portland International Airport the way he always walked through spaces where people underestimated him, quietly with his chin level and his eyes taking in everything. The charcoal gray wool hoodie was soft from years of washing. The dark-fitted chinos were clean but unremarkable. The white New Balance sneakers had a small scuff on the left toe that he had noticed and decided not to care about. The worn black leather duffel over his right shoulder was the same bag he had carried since his second year of graduate school at Wharton, back when he was 24, and had exactly one suit and the absolute burning certainty that he was going to build something that would outlast every room that had ever made him feel small. He had not been wrong. Webb and Hargrove Capital Group had been operating for 19 years. In that time, Marcus and his founding partner Gerald Hargrove, now semi-retired in Savannah, had acquired, restructured, and repositioned 23 companies across infrastructure logistics, hospitality, and transportation. The firm managed just over $4.1 billion in assets. It employed across its various holdings more than 8,000 people in 14 states. 3 days ago, Webb and Hargrove had completed the acquisition they had been quietly building toward for 3 years. A 71% controlling stake in Elevate Airways, a mid-sized national carrier operating 47 routes across the continental United States. The deal had closed on a Wednesday afternoon in a conference room in Chicago with lawyers on both sides and the quiet, specific satisfaction of a transaction that had been worth every hour of the 36-month negotiation. The public announcement was scheduled for Monday morning, a carefully staged press conference. A joint statement from Marcus and Elevate's newly installed CEO, Priya Okafor. The measured language of corporate transformation. The whole production. But Marcus Webb had a rule he had enforced since his third acquisition. A rule that had occasionally baffled his advisors and consistently proven itself right. Before you restructure anything, you live inside it first. You eat the food that the customers eat. You sit in the seats they sit in. You experience the company the way the people it was built to serve experience it. Without the armor of your title, without the buffer of your executive assistant, without the golden tier status that transforms every interaction into a performance staged for your benefit. He had done it with the regional hotel group in 2016. He had done it with the logistics company in Nashville. He had done it with the hospital network in Denver. Had sat in the waiting room for 2.5 hours on a Tuesday afternoon in November and watched exactly how a company treats the people it claims to serve when it doesn't know the boss is watching. What he found every single time told him more about the culture of a company than any financial audit ever could. Today, he was a passenger, a man with a ticket and a bag and a window seat flying commercial to Chicago to get home to his daughter before the weekend ended. He was seat 2A. Nothing more. He had chosen the window deliberately, not for the view, but because it put his back to the wall and gave him the full sight line of the cabin. Old habit. He noted the crew as he boarded the lead flight attendant, efficient and performative in equal measure, who did not look directly at him when he passed. The younger one, Elena, her name badge read, who smiled at him with the genuine warmth of someone who had not yet learned to calibrate her friendliness based on what a person was wearing. He found his seat, stowed his duffel, sank into the leather and felt for the first time in 72 hours something adjacent to relief. He pulled out his tablet and opened the file he had been working through all week, the architectural schematics for the proposed new terminal at Denver International, complex drawings, security checkpoint grids, structural load calculations rendered in precise red and blue lines, beautiful to Marcus, the geometry of something being built. He had texted Darius Cole, his chief of operations, 20 minutes before boarding on the plane, back Monday. Don't let anyone move the Denver files. Darius had responded in 2 words, already done. That was the thing about Darius. He never needed 3 words when 2 worked fine, and he never needed 2 when 1 would do. In 9 years of working together, Marcus had come to understand that Darius's brevity was not curtness. It was precision. The man simply did not waste anything, including language. Marcus settled into his seat and scrolled to the section of the Denver schematics that covered the security checkpoint flow between terminals B and C. He had a note from the infrastructure team suggesting they widen the primary corridor by 4 feet. He wanted to think through the cost implications before Monday's briefing. He did not notice Peggy Ashworth in 4B watching him. He did not notice the way her eyes moved from his hoodie to his seat number and back again, running the calculation that her particular kind of certainty had been running her entire life. He did not notice when she pressed the call button the first time. He was too busy building something. There was one more thing about Marcus Webb that the people of Flight 219 would not learn until it was far too late to do anything with the information. He had grown up in Detroit, the son of a math teacher named Raymond Webb and a registered nurse named Gloria. They had raised him and his younger sister Camille in a house on the east side with a leaking porch roof and a backyard garden that his mother treated like a second religion. They had not had money. They had not had connections. What they had given him instead was a particular kind of education, the kind that can't be bought or credentialed, only lived. His father had taught him, when a man shows you his ceiling, don't hit your head on it. Build around it. He had been building around ceilings his entire adult life. Tonight, one more ceiling was about to come down. The first-class cabin of Flight 219 held 12 seats arranged in a 2-2 configuration across 6 rows. At 9:47 p.m., with the Portland rain still drumming against the jet bridge, 11 of those seats were occupied, and the pre-departure energy in the cabin was the particular quiet hum of people settling in for the night. Laptops, opening blankets, unfolding the soft percussion of overhead bins clicking shut. Seat 1C, James Whitfield, gray-haired and steady, a worn paperback open across his knee. A man who read physical books in an age of screens, which said something about him that he would have been too modest to articulate himself. Seat 2, a Marcus Webb tablet, glowing schematics filling the screen in precise architectural lines. Seat 4, B, Peggy Ashworth, 58, arranging her carry-on in the overhead bin with the deliberate attention of a woman who considered overhead bin space a merit-based allocation system. She wore a cream linen blouse beneath a structured blazer, a double strand of pearls at her throat, and the particular expression of someone perpetually calculating whether the world was showing her the appropriate level of deference. She ran a successful supply company out of Naperville, Illinois. She had been on the Regional Business Excellence list twice. She gave to her church and believed sincerely in fairness. Her version of it. Seat 4D. A young white man in a tech startup hoodie, the irony of which was entirely lost on Peggy Ashworth, already asleep, head tilted against the window mouth slightly open. Elena Vasquez moved through the cabin with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to read the temperature of a room in the first 30 seconds. She was 29, with quick dark eyes and the kind of composure that looked easy because she worked hard to keep it that way. She offered water. She checked bins. She smiled at everyone, a real smile, rather than the laminated customer service version that Diane Crowley wore like a uniform. She paused at 2A and offered a beverage. Marcus looked up briefly from his tablet and shook his head with a quiet nod of thanks. Elena moved on. Diane Crowley did not come through the main cabin during boarding. She stayed near the forward galley, managing the pre-departure inventory with the focused energy of a woman who considered the first-class section of this aircraft her private domain. 18 years of seniority had calcified certain beliefs in Diane about who belonged in premium cabins and what belonging looked like. She was not a monster, or at least she would never have described herself as one. She was in her own telling simply a professional who maintained standards. She noticed Marcus during boarding, registered him without acknowledging him the way a person registers something that doesn't fit their internal taxonomy. The hoodie, the sneakers, the black man in the window seat. She had noted the seat number. She had thought nothing further about it because there was nothing further to think, except the thought wouldn't quite leave. Peggy Ashworth had no such ambivalence. The moment she settled into 4B and oriented herself in the cabin, she saw the man in 2A and felt something tighten in her chest, a feeling she would have called instinct if someone asked her to name it, and which was actually something considerably less noble. She watched him open his tablet. She watched the screen fill with lines and grids, complex, technical, covered in annotations, and what appeared to her untrained eye to be structural diagrams with security zones marked in red. Her mind, moving fast in entirely the wrong direction, assembled the image into something threatening. She didn't know what architectural schematics looked like. She didn't know what a terminal expansion blueprint was. She knew what fear looked like, or rather she knew what she had been taught to fear. And the image on that screen, combined with the man holding it, combined with the seat he was sitting in, added up to something in her mind that she felt absolutely certain about. She pressed the call button. Elena was closer and moved first, already turning toward the sound, but Diane appeared from the galley doorway before Elena could take 2 steps. Diane's hand came down lightly on Elena's forearm, the lightest possible touch, almost nothing but loaded with the full weight of 18 years of seniority. Her eyes flicked toward 4B. "I've got this one." Her voice was pleasant. Her eyes were already moving. Elena stopped. She watched Diane walk down the aisle. Then she turned back toward the galley, but she didn't go in. She stood near the curtain just out of view and waited. Diane reached Peggy's row and crouched down to seat level. The practiced crouch of a flight attendant managing a delicate situation, spine-straight face arranged in an expression of attentive concern. "Can I help you, Mrs. Ashworth?" And Peggy told her. She told her about the diagram, about the way the man had rushed onto the plane. He hadn't, but the story had already reshaped itself in her memory into the form that matched her fear. She told her about the hoodie, the way he was just sitting there without talking to anyone, the way he had barely acknowledged the flight attendant who offered him water. Each detail slightly more alarmed than the one before. Each detail completely ordinary when stripped of the frame she was pressing it into. Diane listened with focused attention. She asked one question. "Which seat?" Peggy said, 2A. Diane nodded. She said she would handle it. She said, "We prioritize the safety and comfort of our premium passengers above all else." The words came out smooth and automatic, the way phrases come out when they have been said so many times they have stopped carrying their original meaning. As Diane stood and moved back toward the galley, Elena slipped away from the curtain and went to offer water to the passengers in rows 5 and 6. She kept her face still, but her jaw was tight. Diane stood over the manifest tablet for 40 seconds longer than she needed to. She already knew what she was going to do. Had known since Peggy Ashworth's pearls swayed forward and her voice dropped to that particular register of manufactured fear. But Diane was the kind of woman who liked her decisions to feel procedural, and so she gave the manifest the performance of thorough review before she gave herself permission to act on what she had already decided. The name M. Webb. No elite tier status, no corporate account flag, no notation in the loyalty field. Nothing in the profile to suggest the kind of passenger who in Diane's privately maintained taxonomy had earned the right to sit in row 2. She swiped through the record twice. No history of upgrades, no corporate travel agreement. Just a name and a standard ticket purchase and a seat that cost more than most people's car payments. To Diane Crowley, this was not evidence of someone who had simply chosen to book a flight without enrolling in the loyalty program. It was in the story she was already writing a gap where legitimacy should have been. A silence where an alibi was missing. She showed the screen to Kevin, who stood at the galley prep counter eating a mint and trying to look useful. He glanced at the manifest the way you glance at something when you have already decided the relevant question is above your pay grade. "Looks normal to me," he said, which was the only accurate thing said in that galley in the next 30 minutes. Diane said, "It's the profile that's missing, not the name." Kevin nodded as if he understood what that meant. He did not. But he knew enough to know that when Diane Crowley used that particular tone of voice, the smart move was to nod and stay close. Back in seat 4, B. Peggy Ashworth was not a woman who could set something in motion and then leave it alone. She was constitutionally incapable of it. Had been since childhood, when her particular mix of conviction and restlessness had expressed itself as the girl who always raised her hand, always asked the follow-up question, always needed to know that the thing she had flagged had been properly addressed. It was depending on the context, either an asset or an affliction. Tonight it was something else entirely. She glanced toward the galley curtain. She glanced at seat 2A. She looked back at the galley curtain. On the tablet screen, visible from 4 rows back if she craned slightly forward, which she did, the architectural diagrams were still there. Lines and grids and red-marked zones that she could not read and would not try to, because trying to read them would have required admitting that she didn't know what they meant, and Peggy Ashworth had built 58 years of identity on the unexamined certainty that her instincts were reliable. She glanced at the tablet screen again. She reached for the call button a second time. Elena appeared first, again, and this time Diane was half a second slower from the galley. Elena reached for B and said with genuine warmth, "Can I get you something, ma'am?" Peggy looked past her toward the galley curtain. "Is the other attendant handling my concern?" Elena said carefully, "I believe she's looking into it." Peggy straightened in her seat. "Good," she said with the compressed satisfaction of someone who has decided that follow-through is a character virtue when applied to themselves. "I just want to make sure everyone is safe." She picked up her sparkling water, took a deliberate sip, and looked again toward seat 2. A. Elena returned to the galley. She stood at the counter and looked at Kevin, who looked back at her with the expression of a man performing neutrality because it was safer than having a position. "She's pressing this," Elena said quietly. "Diane said she's handling it," Kevin said. "I know she did." Elena said nothing more. She picked up the tray of pre-departure beverages and went back into the cabin. In seat 1, C. James Whitfield had been tracking the pattern of movement with the attention of a man accustomed to following the invisible architecture of a situation. The who, the what, the sequence of small decisions that accumulate into something undeniable. He had watched Elena approach Peggy twice. He had watched Diane disappear behind the galley curtain and not return. He had watched Kevin hover near the entrance like a man trying to be close to authority without having to exercise any. He had also watched the man in seat 2A, who had not moved, who had not spoken, who had not looked up from his tablet except once when Elena offered him water, and who had responded to that interaction with a quiet nod and returned immediately to his work. The man was reading documents the way people read documents when they are deeply engaged with them. Leaning slightly forward, occasionally scrolling once, lifting a finger to trace a line on the screen. There was absolutely nothing alarming about any of this. James Whitfield had spent 22 years as a federal judge. He knew what alarming looked like. What he was watching was not alarming. What he was watching was a black man being assigned the burden of being alarming by people who were in a position to do him harm with that assignment. He had seen this before. Not from this angle. Usually from a higher one behind a bench looking down at the aftermath of exactly this kind of moment, after it had already metastasized into something that destroyed lives and careers and freedom. He had written opinions about it. He had made rulings about it. Now he was watching it assemble itself live from 30 feet away, and he was in a window seat on a commercial aircraft with no authority to stop it. What he had was a phone, a memory for details, and 22 years of practice at knowing exactly which details would matter later. He opened his phone's notes app. He began to type. At 9:54 p.m., he wrote the lead flight attendant, name badge Diane Crowley, was summoned to seat 4B by a female passenger in pearls. Brief conversation, approximately 90 seconds. Attendant then returned to galley. Second approach by passenger to galley attendant at approximately 9:57 p.m. Subject of attention, male passenger seat 2. A dark skin, gray hoodie, tablet open to technical documents. No observable conduct issues. He put the phone face down on his knee and picked up his paperback. He opened it. He did not read a word of it. Diane Crowley emerged from the galley. She held nothing. No clipboard, no tablet, just herself and the 18 years of unchecked certainty that had shaped the particular set of her jaw and the particular angle of her chin. She looked down the aisle toward 2A. Then she began to walk. Diane walked down the aisle the way people walk when they want to be watched doing it. Back straight, chin lifted, footsteps precise and deliberate on the narrow carpet. She was performing authority. Not exercising it, performing it, which is a different thing entirely, though people who have never been held accountable for the difference rarely notice the gap. She stopped at row 2 and positioned herself at the full standing height advantage, a choice that was not accidental and was not subtle. From this angle, she looked down at Marcus Webb with the practiced authority of a woman who had been the largest figure in every interaction she'd had in this cabin for 18 years. Marcus did not look up immediately. He finished the line he was reading, set his stylus down on the armrest, and then raised his eyes to meet hers. His expression was what it had been since he sat down. Composed, attentive, completely unafraid. "Excuse me, sir." Diane's voice was loud enough to carry through the first 4 rows. Not shouting. Something more targeted than shouting. The volume of a woman who wanted witnesses without appearing to want them. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass." Marcus paused. He looked at her the way you look at something that doesn't quite make sense yet. "My boarding pass." His voice was measured. I scanned it at the gate. "Yeah. I need to physically verify it, sir." Diane crossed her arms over the front of her jacket. "We have procedures in the premium cabin. I need to confirm you're in the correct seat." Marcus looked around the cabin. James Whitfield was watching. The man in 4D had woken up and was blinking at the ceiling. Peggy Ashworth, 4 rows back, had angled her body toward the aisle. No one else in first class was being asked to produce documentation. The older white gentleman in 1A was reading his newspaper undisturbed. The 2 men in row 3 were discussing something about a golf course in Scottsdale with complete freedom. Only seat 2A was under review. "I see," Marcus said. His voice had dropped 1 register. Not lower in volume, lower in temperature. He reached into his chinos pocket and retrieved his phone. He pulled up the digital boarding pass and held the screen out toward her. Marcus Webb, seat 2A, Portland to Chicago, as requested. Diane looked at the screen. Her lips compressed into a thin line. The pass was valid. The seat assignment was correct. The name matched the manifest. There was nothing, not one procedurally defensible thing, left to question. She should have said, "Thank you, sir. I apologize for the inconvenience." She should have walked back to the galley and found a reason not to look at Peggy Ashworth. She should have let the moment end. She didn't, because Peggy was watching. Because Kevin was hovering near the galley curtain. Because 18 years of operating without consequence had trained Diane to interpret every challenge to her authority as an attack that required escalation rather than a correction that required humility. "And what exactly are you working on there, Mr. Webb?" She gestured toward the tablet with a small, deliberate nod. Another passenger expressed concern about the materials you're reviewing. Marcus's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A quality of attention, a sharpening like a lens, clicking into focus. He was in that moment running a calculation that Diane had no way of knowing he was running. He was measuring the distance between where this conversation was and where it was going, and he was deciding with complete precision how much rope to extend. "I am reviewing architectural drawings for a commercial development project," he said. His voice was even. "Informational. Would you like me to explain what a load-bearing wall is?" Diane's jaw tightened. "Sir, I'm not asking about the content. I'm telling you that a fellow passenger has reported me for reading." Marcus finished. "Yes, I understand that's what's happening." He looked at her with calm, undivided attention. "I'd like to ask you something. Have you approached anyone else in this cabin and asked them to explain what they're working on?" Diane said nothing. "The gentleman in 1A has a newspaper." "Have you verified the content?" Marcus continued, his voice never rising. "The men in row 3 are discussing what sounds like a real estate deal. Did you ask them to justify their conversation?" "Don't take that tone with me," Diane said. Her face had begun to flush, not with embarrassment, but with the specific heat of a person who has confused having authority with being right. "I am responsible for the safety of everyone on this aircraft." "I haven't raised my voice," Marcus said. "I haven't moved from my seat. I've been sitting here for 14 minutes doing exactly what I told you I was doing." A pause. Measured, deliberate. "Ms. Crowley, I'm looking at your name badge. I'd like you to think carefully about what you're doing right now." "Not for my sake, for yours." From her position near the galley curtain, Elena Vasquez had appeared with a tray of pre-departure beverages she was no longer actually distributing. She had set one glass down near row 3 as cover, and slowed to near stillness, her dark eyes moving between Diane and the man in 2A. Her jaw was tight enough that the muscles along it were visible. She wanted to speak. The words were fully formed in her throat, but when she moved one step toward the aisle, Diane's eyes snapped to her with a precision that said, "If you take one more step, I will end your day before it starts." Elena stopped. She looked at Marcus. Something passed between them. Not words, not even quite a look, more a frequency of recognition. Two people who have both memorized this particular shape of the world, reading it in each other's faces. Marcus gave her the smallest movement of his head. Barely there. Not yet. Elena stayed where she was. Sir Diane said, turning back to row 2, her voice dropping to the register of someone delivering a final warning. "If you cannot cooperate with crew instructions, I'm going to need to escalate this." Marcus looked up at her. His eyes were steady and entirely without performance. "Ms. Crowley." A pause. "I want you to understand something clearly. This moment is not going to end the way you think it is. I am giving you one opportunity right now to walk back to the galley and leave this alone." He held her gaze without blinking. "Walk back to the galley. Leave this alone. That is the last time I am going to say it to you." Diane stared at him. She heard the words. She processed them. And she made the choice that every person who has never faced real accountability makes when given a genuine warning by someone who has the power to enforce it. She decided the warning was a threat. "Is that supposed to be a threat, sir?" Her chin came up. Her voice rose just enough. "It's a statement of fact," Marcus said. "There's a difference. A beat." 2 seconds of silence in which everything that was going to happen in the next 4 hours was already decided. Then Diane Crowley turned toward the cockpit and she walked. And in seat 4, B, Peggy Ashworth exhaled and settled back into her seat with the private, righteous satisfaction of a woman who has set something irreversible in motion and called it caution. And in seat 1, C, James Whitfield opened his phone and typed 3 more words into his notes. 11:01 p.m. Escalating. The motion of reaching for his phone pulled something loose in Marcus's memory, a specific physical pull like a thread catching on a nail. His thumb was on the screen, and then he was not entirely in seat 2A anymore. He was somewhere older. He was 32 years old, and he was in Memphis, and he had just made the most important deal of his young career. It had been a Tuesday in November. He had flown in that morning, connecting through Atlanta no direct flights from Detroit on the budget that the firm was operating at in those years, and landed at Memphis International with a briefcase, a rolled-up presentation deck, and the tight electric feeling in his chest that comes from knowing a deal is close. By 3 p.m. that afternoon, the deal was done. Regional logistics company, 14 trucks, 2 warehouses, and a client roster that would become the spine of Webb and Hargrove's first major revenue year. He had been wearing exactly what he was wearing tonight. Hoodie, chinos, sneakers. He had packed light because he planned to be home by Thursday. He walked into the restaurant of the downtown business hotel where he was staying. The nicest hotel he had ever booked for himself at that point, the kind that had cloth napkins and a menu without prices, which Marcus had found both elegant and quietly amusing. He was hungry. He had not eaten since a granola bar on the second connection. The deal was done, and he wanted a real meal and a glass of something good, and he had earned both things. The maitre d' was a white man in his early 50s, pressed and meticulous, who looked up from the reservation stand with the smile that transforms in the space between 1 second and the next when it recalibrates against something unexpected. The smile didn't disappear. It recalibrated. "Good evening. Do you have a reservation?" Marcus said he didn't, but he'd be happy to wait if there was a table available. He could see the dining room from where he stood. He counted 4 empty tables. "I'm afraid we're fully booked this evening," the maitre d' said. His voice was professionally apologetic. His hands were clasped in front of him with the precision of a man who had been trained to perform regret without feeling it. Marcus looked at the 4 empty tables. He looked back at the maitre d'. He said evenly, "I can see some available tables from here. Those are reserved for the evening. All 4 of them." A pause. A recalibration. "Yes, sir. I'm very sorry." Marcus stood still for a moment. He was aware of the particular quality of the silence, the way it had a shape, a weight, the way it pressed against him from a specific direction. He had felt this shape before. He would feel it again. He was 32 years old, and he had already learned that the way you respond to this shape determines a great deal about who you become. He did not argue. He did not demand to speak to a manager. He did not make a scene in a restaurant that did not deserve the theater of his anger. He thanked the man, turned, and walked to the hotel bar. He sat down on a stool and ordered a sparkling water and opened his laptop. The document he opened was a half-finished acquisition strategy for a regional hotel group he had been considering for 6 months. He had been putting it off. The numbers were complicated and the timeline was aggressive, and he wasn't sure he was ready. He sat at that bar in Memphis with the shape of that particular silence still pressing against him, and he worked for 2.5 hours without stopping, and by the time he closed the laptop, his acquisition strategy was done. 3 years later, he bought the hotel group, all 11 properties, including the business hotel in downtown Memphis, including its restaurant. He never ate there. He simply owned it. His mentor, Howard Darrell, a gruff, brilliant man from Birmingham who had taken Marcus on as an associate 19 years ago and had been one of the most important people in his life until Howard died of a heart attack at 68 2 years back, had told him something once when Marcus was 26 and had just been passed over for a promotion he had objectively earned. Howard had looked at him across the desk with the calm of a man who had built his entire career on navigating exactly this territory and said, "The moment they underestimate you is the moment you have the most power. Don't waste it on noise." Marcus in seat 2. With his thumb on his phone screen and Diane Crowley's footsteps receding toward the cockpit, heard Howard's voice as clearly as if the man were sitting in 2B. He looked at the phone. Not yet. He looked out the rain-streaked window at the Portland tarmac. The lights out there were blurring and steadying, blurring and steadying the way lights do through wet glass. He set the phone back in his lap. He breathed slowly. He waited. Let them finish. Every second they continued the case built itself. The cabin had changed in the 30 seconds since Diane walked away. Not loudly. There had been no announcement, no raised voice, but the particular quality of stillness in a small enclosed space had shifted. People who had been in their own private worlds were now quietly in the same one. The man in 4D, whose name was Tyler, who worked in product design for a tech startup in San Francisco, and who would later post a long thread about what he witnessed tonight that would accumulate hundreds of thousands of engagements, had fully woken up. He was sitting with his hands in his lap and his eyes tracking toward the front of the cabin with the wary alertness of someone who has registered that something important is happening and is not yet sure which way it is going to break. James Whitfield had not moved. His paperback was closed and face down, and he had no intention of reopening it. Elena Vasquez had retreated to the galley, but was stationed at the curtain with the precision of someone who had decided they needed to be close to whatever happened next without appearing to wait for it. Kevin Marsh was staring at a spot on the galley floor that had become for him the most interesting piece of carpet in the Western Hemisphere. Marcus sat in 2A with his hands still and his face still, and his mind running at the particular frequency it ran when every detail mattered. Diane returned from the direction of the galley with Kevin half a step behind her, not quite beside her, not quite behind the distance of a man trying to benefit from proximity to authority, while maintaining enough separation to claim he had nothing to do with it. Kevin crossed his arms. He positioned himself 2 feet behind Diane's left shoulder, like a piece of furniture that had decided it agreed with everything in the room. Sir Diane said, resuming the conversation with the seamless confidence of someone who doesn't consider the fact that they've had to leave and return a retreat. I need you to understand that cooperating with the flight crew is not optional during boarding procedures. I've cooperated with every request I've received, Marcus said. I showed you my boarding pass. I identified my work. I spoke to you calmly and directly. He looked at Kevin. Is there something you'd like to add? Kevin blinked. He had not expected to be addressed. He looked at Diane. Diane said, if you could just comply with our crew's requests, sir, we can get this flight moving. Tell me specifically which request I haven't complied with, Marcus said. The tone was not aggressive. It was something more precise than aggression. It was the voice of a man who already knew the answer and was asking the question for a different reason. Name it. Kevin's mouth opened. Closed. He looked at Diane. From seat 4B, Peggy Ashworth unbuckled her seatbelt. She stood up. She smoothed the front of her blazer. And then, with the absolute conviction of a woman who has spent 5 decades trusting her instincts above all evidence to the contrary, she stepped into the aisle. Excuse me. I'm the one who raised the concern, and I think it's perfectly reasonable. Her voice was loud enough for the full front half of the cabin to hear. She gestured toward Marcus's tablet still visible on his knee. I can see what he's looking at from where I'm sitting. And frankly, I've been flying first class for 20 years, and I've never... She stopped. One word too late. Or perhaps the exact right amount of words. Enough to make the sentence's unfinished conclusion perfectly audible to everyone who heard it. The cabin was absolutely silent. Marcus turned his head toward her. Just his head slowly with the patient deliberateness of a man who is giving a moment the weight it deserves. He looked at her. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The silence that followed Peggy Ashworth's almost finished sentence was doing more work than any words he could have deployed. It hung there, precise, undeniable, the exact shape of what she had almost said. And every person in that cabin heard it. Peggy looked at the expression on Marcus Webb's face. Not anger, not even contempt, something quieter and more damaging than either, and sat back down. From seat 1C, without standing and without raising his voice, James Whitfield said, I've been sitting in this cabin for the past 12 minutes. That man has not moved, has not raised his voice, and has done nothing other than read from a tablet. I'd like someone to explain to me specifically and clearly what the security concern is. The words were not hot. They were not theatrical. They arrived with the flat, unhurried authority of 22 years of federal jurisprudence, and they landed in the cabin the way a gavel lands. Not as a question that needed answering, but as a statement that closed something. Diane stiffened. Kevin looked at the carpet again. Peggy kept her eyes on her sparkling water. Marcus looked at Diane. Only at Diane. His voice dropped to a register that only the first 4 rows could catch. Ms. Crowley. A pause. I want to be very clear with you. This moment is not going to end the way you have decided it is going to end. I have told you this once. I am telling you again because I believe in giving people the full information they need to make a decision. He held her gaze without blinking. Walk back to the galley. Leave this alone. That is the last time I'm going to say it to you. Diane's face was a portrait of a woman who has been told something she has decided to hear as an affront rather than a warning. She looked at him with the tight, charged expression of someone whose ego has just reorganized all available information in order to protect itself. Are you threatening me, sir? The word sir, coming out slightly wrong, weighted wrong the way words do when they are being used as a weapon in a situation that has already been decided. I am stating a fact, Marcus said. The difference between a threat and a fact is that one of them comes true. 3 seconds of silence. Then Diane Crowley turned toward the cockpit and walked away. And Marcus Webb reached for his phone. He looked at the screen. He looked out the window at the rain. He thought about Howard Durrell. He thought about his daughter Amara, who was 16 and sleeping at home in Chicago right now, and who had called him 6 months ago from school voice shaking because a teacher had told her she must have had help writing her English essay. He remembered what he had told her. You don't shrink. You document, and then you rebuild. He pressed the home button. He did not dial yet. He put the phone in his pocket. Not yet. Let them finish. The cockpit door unlatched with a sound that was quiet, but that everyone in the first-class cabin registered immediately. The particular sound of an authority being invoked, a chamber being opened, a different and larger kind of trouble entering the room. Captain Arthur Pelham stepped through the door with the energy of a man who considered any interruption to his pre-departure checklist a personal offense against the natural order of things. He was 57, barrel-chested, silver-haired in the way that certain men are silver-haired, not as a sign of aging, but as an additional credential, something that had arrived right on schedule and enhanced the overall argument of his presence. He had 31 years of seniority with Elevate Airways. He wore that seniority the way he wore his 4 gold stripes, not as a responsibility, but as a rank, which is a different thing entirely. He had a reputation among his first officers for having what the younger crew called a very short runway, meaning the distance between receiving information and reaching an unalterable conclusion was shorter than the FAA would have preferred. He did not consider this a flaw. He considered it decisiveness. Elena Vasquez, positioned at the galley curtain, watched Diane speak to him in low, rapid sentences. She could not hear the words from where she stood, but she could read everything she needed to in Diane's body language, leaning forward, one hand gesturing toward row 2, head tilted with the particular angle of a person performing distress for an audience of 1. Pelham's face went from impatient to decided in approximately 4 seconds. Elena watched that happen, watched the decision land in his face and set there the way concrete sets, and felt something cold move through her chest. She stepped back from the curtain. She picked up her phone from the galley counter and looked at it. She set it back down. She picked it up again. Pelham came down the aisle without the performance of it, without the straightened back and the deliberate stride. He came down the aisle the way a problem comes down an aisle purposefully, without uncertainty, bracing one hand on the headrest of the aisle seat in row 2 and positioning himself above Marcus with the particular stance of a man whose entire concept of authority is spatial. Sir. Not a greeting. A classification. We've had a report. You're going to need to come with me. Marcus looked up from his tablet without urgency. Come with you, we're captain off the aircraft. We'll have airport security review the situation and determine if you can continue on this flight. What have I done? You've been identified as a potential security concern by a fellow passenger, Pelham said, and that report has been confirmed by my crew. Confirmed how Marcus asked. Pelham did not answer. Captain Pelham, Marcus said, his voice even and precise. I am asking you a direct question. How has a report that I am a security concern been confirmed? What specific behavior have I exhibited that rises to that level? Pelham's jaw tightened. This was not the response he had been calibrated for. Passengers who were asked to deplane either argued loudly or complied immediately. This This measured, specific, completely calm interrogation was not in his taxonomy. My crew determined that your behavior was causing concern. On my aircraft, the crew's determination is sufficient. I've been sitting in this seat for 15 minutes reading a document, Marcus said. Have you asked any other passenger in this cabin to account for what they're reading? That's not the point. I'd like to understand the point then, because from where I'm sitting, the only difference between me and every other person in this cabin is what I look like. And if that's the criterion your crew is applying, I'd like you to say that clearly. The cabin was entirely silent. Tyler in 4D had his phone in his hand, tilted at an angle that suggested he was doing something with it. James Whitfield had both hands resting still on his closed paperback. Pelham's face had gone the color of old brick. He was not a man who had ever had to articulate the rationale for a decision he had reached intuitively, and the demand that he do so felt like an attack. He leaned closer. His voice dropped. Listen. The crew's word is law on this aircraft. I don't care what you were doing or not doing. If my flight attendant says there's a problem, there's a problem. That's how this works. So, there's no process, Marcus said. No standard. Just the crew's judgment applied selectively without documentation or cause. I don't need a passenger lecturing me about process, Pelham snapped. No, Marcus agreed. You need a passenger telling you the truth. He looked at Pelham with total calm. Captain, I'm going to ask you one time to look up my name in the Elevate Airways corporate passenger registry. Not my booking record. The registry. My full name, Marcus Darrell Webb. Do it right now before you make the call you're about to make, because once you make it, I cannot undo it for you. I'm giving you the information you need. What you do with it is your decision. Pelham looked at him. His expression said, I am not going to be told what to do by a passenger in a hoodie. What he said was, I don't check registries at the request of passengers. That is not how I run my aircraft. Marcus was quiet for a moment. I understand, he said. It was the quietest, most precisely targeted sentence in the cabin. It said, I offered. You refused. I'm noting both. Then Pelham made the decision that would define the remainder of his professional career. He straightened. He looked at the galley curtain. Diane, his voice carrying cleanly through the first-class cabin. Call Port Authority. We're removing this passenger. Security risk. Elena Vasquez, still at the curtain, made a sound. Not quite a word, not quite a breath somewhere between them. She stepped forward one step, one full step into the aisle, her eyes on Pelham. But Pelham's eyes went to her with the immediacy of a man who has handled insubordination before and considers it a category of threat. The look he gave her was absolute and brief, and said everything about the power dynamic she was operating inside. She stopped, her hands at her sides, fingers closed. She looked at Marcus, who was looking at her again with that same small, deliberate signal, not yet. His eyes telling her, I know. I see you. Wait. Elena stepped back. She went to the galley. She picked up her phone from the counter. Her hands were very still as she opened her email and began to type. Diane picked up the intercom receiver. Her face had the specific brightness of a woman who has waited a long time for permission to do something she has wanted to do and has finally received it. Timothy. Her voice into the receiver carrying into the main cabin through the thin partition. This is Diane on Flight 219. We need Port Authority at the aircraft immediately. Seat 2A. Passenger refusing crew instructions. Possible security issue. Marcus sat in 2A. He did not move. He did not speak. He closed his tablet slowly, placed it on the seat beside him, and folded his hands in his lap. He looked straight ahead at the headrest of Seat 1A. He thought, let them finish. He thought, every second they continue the case builds itself. He thought, Amara, I'm going to tell you about tonight when I get home. Before we go any further, I need to stop here for just a second. Because if you have ever walked into a room, sat in a seat, or stood in a line where you felt the full weight of someone deciding that you did not belong, based on nothing except what you looked like, I want you to drop a comment below right now. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me if you've lived a version of this moment. Because Marcus Webb is about to do something with what just happened to him that I promise you have never seen handled quite like this. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet. Share this one with someone who needs to see it. Because what comes next, the phone call, the private jet, the moment those gate doors open in Chicago, is something that will stay with you. Let's keep going. The intercom click was small, the kind of sound that barely registers in an active environment. But Flight 219 was not an active environment anymore. Flight 219 was 12 people in a pressurized metal tube at a rain-soaked gate in Portland. And every one of those 12 people had already understood in the way that people understand things before they are said what was coming. Diane's voice came through the cabin speaker with the practiced smoothness of someone who has been trained to deliver information without delivering information. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the brief delay in our departure. We will be asking one passenger to deplane for a standard security verification. This is a routine procedure, and we appreciate your patience and understanding. We expect to be underway shortly. The words were clinical, sanitized, scrubbed of every specific detail that might have allowed a listener to assess what was actually happening. But the words didn't need to contain the information. The information was already in the cabin, had been building for the past 22 minutes, and every person in that cabin already knew exactly which seat she meant. In 4B, Peggy Ashworth exhaled, slowly, quietly, with the private relief of a woman who has been carrying a concern and has now transferred it to someone else's hands. She adjusted her pearls. She picked up her sparkling water. She did not look at seat 2A. In 1D, a woman who had been pretending to sleep since Diane first walked down the aisle pressed her face a few degrees deeper into her travel pillow and tried to make herself very small, which is what people do when they can feel the wrongness of something and cannot find the vocabulary for why acting on that feeling is their responsibility. In 4D, Tyler had both thumbs moving on his phone screen. He was not posting yet. He was composing. He was also with the secondary camera on his phone angled in a way that was not entirely accidental recording. James Whitfield had opened his notes app again. He added 10:09 p.m. intercom announcement. Passenger removal announced via PA to full cabin. Subject M. Webb, seat 2A. No observable cause. Then he closed the app. He looked toward the front of the cabin. The heavy footsteps on the jet bridge arrived 3 minutes and 40 seconds after Diane made the call. Marcus noted the time, noted the interval, filed it. 3 Port Authority officers stepped through the forward door with the careful, controlled entry of people who have learned to read a room before they commit to it. They were uniformed-equipped professional. They looked at Captain Pelham, who was standing near the galley entrance with his arms crossed and his chin up. "That's him," Pelham said. He pointed toward row 2 with the rigid, certain finger of a man who believes he is protecting something. Officer Ray Mendoza was in front. He was 35, compact, and careful in the way of someone who had learned that precision was more useful than force. He looked at where Pelham was pointing. He looked at the man in seat 2A. He ran the assessment that he ran in every situation, the one that had kept him out of trouble in 5 years on the Port Authority. Beat the one that asked, "What is the evidence?" versus "What is the assertion?" The evidence was a man sitting quietly with his hands visible in his lap. The assertion was a captain with a red face pointing a rigid finger. Mendoza walked down the aisle. He stopped at row 2. He looked at Marcus. At the stillness of him, the total absence of aggression, the way his body language communicated none of the things that body language communicates when a person is a genuine security concern, Sir Mendoza said. His voice was quiet, not theatrical. "I'm going to need you to come with us." Marcus looked at Mendoza. He looked at the 2 officers behind him. He looked at the expressions on their faces and calibrated them with the accuracy of a man who had been reading rooms his entire adult life. He made a decision. "Understood," he said. He moved with complete deliberateness. He reached up to the overhead bin with slow, visible movements. He lifted his duffel. He set it on the seat beside him. He picked up his tablet. He put on his phone. He stood, gathered his belongings, and stepped into the aisle. No sudden movements, No raised voice, no argument. Every movement slow and visible and utterly calm, because he knew the way he had known since he was 19 years old in Detroit that the cost of not being calm in this particular shape of moment was a cost that was his to pay and no one else's, and he had decided years before tonight that he would not pay it. "Hands visible, sir," said one of the officers behind Mendoza. "They are visible," Marcus said quietly. He walked toward the front of the cabin. He passed Kevin Marsh, who found something urgent to look at on the galley counter. He passed the galley entrance, and there was Diane Crowley stationed near the forward door with her arms crossed, and the expression of a woman savoring a private vindication. She said, "Have a pleasant evening, sir." The sarcasm wrapped around every syllable like something she had been holding in reserve for exactly this moment. Marcus stopped. It was a stop of perhaps half a second, no more. A fractional pause the length of a breath. He turned his head and looked at Diane Crowley directly with an expression that contained no anger, no contempt, no performance of any kind. Just a look that lasted long enough to be unmistakable. He said nothing. He walked off the aircraft. The cold air of the jet bridge hit him, stale and pressurized and carrying the metallic smell of an airport terminal at night. Behind him, he heard the distinct sound of Peggy Ashworth's voice somewhere in the cabin saying something to the woman beside her that he couldn't make out. He heard the door mechanism begin its cycle. He walked up the bridge with Mendoza beside him. Beside, not behind, which Marcus noticed and filed away, and did not look back. In seat 1C, James Whitfield stood up. He moved into the aisle. He caught Mendoza's eye just before the officer turned at the top of the ramp. James gave one small nod, the nod of a man indicating that he sees what is happening and is prepared to be a witness to all of it. Mendoza held the eye contact for a beat, then turned and followed Marcus into the terminal. The door to Flight 219 closed behind them. The sound of his own footsteps on the metal jet bridge did something to Marcus's memory, or rather the echoing quality of it did the hollow resonance of a space that amplifies what you bring into it. He heard his footsteps. He heard the rain against the exterior walls. He heard underneath both of those sounds something older. He was 19 years old. He was sitting in the passenger seat of his father's 1994 Buick outside a branch of a commercial bank on the east side of Detroit. It was a Tuesday in March. The sky was the color of old dishwater. The bank had a banner in the window that said, "Community Partnership" in large green letters, which Marcus had read and filed away as something that would require further examination as he got older. Raymond Webb was 52 that year. He wore his best suit, a dark charcoal wool that he reserved for church and serious occasions, and this was a serious occasion. He had spent 11 years saving for it. The folder on his lap contained a business plan, 3 years of personal financial statements, a letter of good standing from his credit union, and 2 letters of reference from business owners in the neighborhood. He had built the plan carefully, methodically, with the mathematical precision of a man who had spent 25 years teaching students that numbers do not lie. He was going to open a printing shop, a simple business, commercial printing business cards, school materials, community flyers. The neighborhood needed it. He had surveyed the neighborhood to confirm it. He had done everything right in exactly the right order with exactly the right documentation. Marcus watched his father walk into the bank. He sat in the Buick and did his homework. He waited 1 hour and 40 minutes. When Raymond came back out, he walked to the car with his folder under his arm and his face composed in the specific way that his face composed itself when he had decided that his children would not see him undone. He got in. He placed the folder on the back seat. He sat for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel. Marcus asked, "What happened?" Raymond said. "The loan officer told me the risk profile wasn't favorable." Marcus asked, "What does that mean?" Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It means he looked at me across the desk and decided that the numbers I had brought him were less convincing than the number I was born with." Marcus didn't fully understand that sentence at 19. He would spend the next 25 years understanding it. His father started the car. He drove back toward their street, and at the corner of Gratiot and Fisher, he said, "Marcus, I want to tell you something, and I want you to remember it exactly." His voice was even, not broken. Never broken, which was its own kind of lesson. When a man shows you his ceiling, don't hit your head on it. Build around it. He did not sound angry. He sounded like a man who had decided a long time ago that anger was too expensive a fuel for the distance he intended to travel. 9 days later, Raymond Webb went to a community development credit union on the east side of Detroit. He got his loan. He opened his printing shop on a Tuesday in April, and Marcus helped him hang the sign. The shop ran for 22 years. It put Marcus through Wharton. It put his sister Camille through nursing school. The last day of business was a quiet one. Raymond, 74 by then, had simply decided it was time and closed the door gently, the way you close a door on something you are proud of. Marcus thought about his father's face on the drive home from that bank, the composure of it, the decision inside the composure, the absolute refusal to let the moment take more from him than it was entitled to. He thought about what it had cost his father to maintain that composure. He thought about how that cost had been passed along silently to Marcus, who had inherited it without being asked whether he wanted it, who had carried it through graduate school and through 19 years of boardrooms and through every room that had ever recalibrated its welcome the moment he walked into it. He thought about Amara, who was 16, and who had called him 6 months ago, voice shaking because a teacher had told her she must have had help writing her essay. He had told her, "You don't shrink. You document. And then you rebuild." Raymond Webb's ceiling. Howard Durrell's warning. His own daughter's shaking voice. Marcus stepped off the metal bridge and into the terminal. Officer Mendoza was still beside him. That small, significant detail, beside not behind. The terminal stretched out ahead of them under the long fluorescent hum of late-night lighting. Marcus reached into his pocket. He touched the encrypted phone. The secondary one, the one he used only for executive-level directives. Not yet, he said to himself, quietly. An old habit. Talking to himself in that particular moment using that particular phrase. Something his father used to say to him during chess games when Marcus was impatient and wanted to make his move before the position had fully revealed itself. Not yet. Let the board show itself. He walked through Portland International Airport, surrounded by 3 officers as calm as a man on a morning walk. Concourse C of Portland International Airport at 10:17 p.m. on a rainy Thursday was busy in the specific way that airport concourses are busy at that hour. Not with the chaotic energy of afternoon travel, but with the quieter, more exhausted traffic of people who wanted to be somewhere else. Business travelers in rolling carry-ons. A family navigating a double stroller. Gate agents at their desks tapping at keyboards with the resigned energy of people 3 hours from the end of a long shift. And in the middle of all of this, Marcus Webb, flanked by 3 Port Authority officers in uniform, walking at a measured pace toward the end of the concourse. People noticed. That was the thing about this particular configuration. The way it demanded to be noticed, the way it was designed to communicate something, the way it was essentially a public statement about who a person was and what they had done even when they had done nothing. A black man in a hoodie, 3 police officers in uniform, an airport terminal at night. The image assembled itself in the minds of the people who saw it with the speed and certainty of something preformed. Some people looked and looked away. Some looked and kept looking. A child, walking beside her mother, pointed and started to ask a question that her mother answered by pulling her gently forward without speaking. A gate agent at C11 looked up from her keyboard and watched them pass, and then looked back down at her keyboard and said nothing. Marcus did not look at any of them. He was running the room the way he had been trained. Not by any formal program, but by decades of necessity. The way you run a room when you are the only person responsible for ensuring that your own dignity survives the experience intact. Eyes forward. Breathing steady. Posture correct. He was cataloging, not emotionally, operationally. He noted the camera positions along the ceiling of Concourse C at each gate junction at the intersections above the security checkpoint at the concourse entrance. He noted that Mendoza was still beside him rather than behind. He noted that neither of the other two officers had touched him or spoken to him since the aircraft, which told him something about how they had been briefed and how they had processed what they found when they arrived at Row 2. Mendoza spoke near the end of the concourse quietly without looking at him directly. The kind of words a person says when they have something to say but are not sure whether the saying of it is within their professional purview. Sir, for what it's worth, and I know it probably isn't worth a great deal right now, I want to say that I apologize for how this is unfolding. Marcus looked at him. He studied the side of the officer's face, the tightness around the jaw that suggested genuine discomfort rather than performance. What's your name, Mendoza? Ray Mendoza. Officer Mendoza. Marcus paused. Thank you. I mean that. Mendoza nodded once small, and they walked the rest of the concourse without speaking. At the gate desk, C7, where Flight 219's boarding documents were still spread across the counter, Bryce Holton was waiting. Marcus had not yet had a detailed look at Bryce Holton, but he had learned in 19 years of reading rooms that you could gather everything you needed to know about a person in approximately 4 seconds of careful observation. Bryce was 34. He wore his gate supervisor badge the way some people wear academic credentials, as the primary evidence of their worth. His posture was the posture of someone performing authority in a context where he was not entirely sure he had enough of it, which is the most dangerous kind of performance because it always tips into excess. Bryce looked at Marcus being escorted by 3 officers, and his face did the thing that certain faces do. Arranged itself into the expression of a man who has decided that what he is witnessing confirms something he already believed. He announced it loudly enough for the terminal to hear. Sir, your ticket has been canceled and you are flagged for a security review. You are prohibited from flying Elevate Airways for the next 72 hours pending investigation. Elevate Airways does not tolerate threatening or disruptive behavior toward our crew. The people at the nearest gates looked up. Several of them did the thing with their phones. I'd like that in writing, Marcus said. Official Elevate Airways documentation. The specific violation code, the name of the crew member who made the initial complaint, and the name of the supervising officer who authorized my removal. His voice was the same register it had been in the cabin. Informational, not confrontational, the voice of a man who knows that documentation is a form of power and that people who abuse authority always underestimate its value. Bryce hesitated. He had not been asked for written documentation before. He looked at his keyboard. It's all in the system, he said. Then print it from the system. Bryce couldn't print it. The form he would need to print it didn't exist in a way that was accessible from his current terminal, which was itself a small but significant piece of information about how the airline had designed its accountability infrastructure. He typed something with theatrical speed, the typing of a person performing competence rather than exhibiting it, and then defaulted to the only tool available to him, which was volume. Sir, I need you to step back from the desk or these officers will escort you from the gate area entirely. Marcus stepped back. One step cooperative visible. Bryce leaned forward across the counter. He glanced at the officers, at the people watching from the nearby gates at Marcus, and then he said it. The line that would 48 hours later appear verbatim in a written statement filed with the Elevate Airways Compliance Office and signed by a retired federal judge. People like you think a first-class ticket comes with first-class manners. The captain made the right call. James Whitfield, who had followed the escort from the aircraft and was standing 20 feet from the gate desk, heard every word. He took out his phone. He opened his notes. He wrote the sentence down exactly as it had been spoken with the time, 10:24 p.m., and the speaker's badge name, B. Holton, Gate Supervisor. Then he wrote one more thing. Witnesses present. Self 3. PAO officers. Approximately 11 to 14 members of public. Full visibility. Multiple phones observed. He closed his phone. Marcus looked at Bryce Holton for 3 measured seconds. He looked at him the way you look at a decision that has already been made. Not with anger, not with contempt, but with the calm, complete attention of someone who intends to remember this moment with precision. "Have a good evening," Marcus said. He turned. He did not walk toward the exit. He walked toward an empty seating area near gate C4, which was closed and dark. A cluster of black plastic chairs beneath a departure board cycling through updated flight times in the cool blue light. He sat down. He set his duffel between his feet. He set his tablet and his phone on the seat beside him. He breathed. Bryce Holton, watching Marcus walk away, had the brief and entirely unfounded feeling of a man who has just won something. He turned back to his keyboard. He made a note in the system. Passenger removed from Flight 219 per captain's authorization. Ticket canceled. 72-hour flag applied. He used the language the system preferred, neutral procedural scrubbed of the particular satisfaction he felt while typing it. He straightened his badge. He looked toward his colleague at the neighboring gate counter and gave the small collegial nod of a man who believes he has just demonstrated something about himself. His colleague, a woman named Patricia, who had worked Concourse C for 11 years, and who had been watching the entire episode with the contained expression of someone choosing not to have a public opinion on something she has a very clear private one about, nodded back once and returned to her screen. Bryce looked toward where Marcus was now seated in the darkened seating area near gate C4. He watched the man sit down without ceremony, place his belongings beside him, and do nothing dramatic whatsoever. No shouting, no phone calls, no scene. Bryce interpreted this as defeat. He was wrong about this in the same way he had been wrong about most things tonight, completely, and from a position of complete confidence. The public dimension of what had just happened was still accruing. 3 people at the nearby gates had recorded portions of the escort. Tyler, still on the aircraft at that moment, but who would land and post within the hour, had footage. The woman with the stroller who had been watching from gate C11 had taken 3 photographs on her phone and was deciding what to do with them. James Whitfield had written 2 pages of detailed time-stamped notes in the precise structured language of a man who has written judicial opinions and understands the difference between observation and interpretation. The physical record of Bryce Holton's public performance was more comprehensive than he could have imagined, assembled by strangers in the span of 8 minutes, and it was not going away. What Bryce did not know, could not have known because the public announcement of the Webb and Hargrove acquisition was not scheduled until Monday morning, was that the man he had just banned from the airline had signed the paperwork that technically made Bryce's salary a Webb and Hargrove operating expense, that the airline Bryce worked for had new ownership, that the new ownership had a clean, well-documented policy on discriminatory conduct by customer-facing staff, a policy that had been written by lawyers retained by that same ownership, and that included specific language about the kind of public documented witnessed statement that Bryce had just made at a volume that guaranteed it would be remembered. He had no way of knowing any of this. So Bryce Holton adjusted his badge, straightened his posture, and returned to work with the untroubled confidence of a man who has never, not once in his adult professional life, been held accountable for anything. It was in retrospect the only kind of confidence he had ever possessed. In the seating area near gate C4, Marcus sat with his hands resting on his knees and allowed himself for the first time since he had settled into seat 2A to feel the full weight of the evening. Not to perform it, not to process it for an audience, not to shape it into something useful yet, just to feel it. It was a specific weight, not unfamiliar. He had been carrying versions of it his entire life, but specific to this night, this terminal, this particular configuration of people who had looked at him and made a decision before he had done a single thing. The weight of being paraded through a public concourse by 3 uniformed officers because a woman in pearls had looked at his tablet and been afraid. The weight of knowing that there were people on that flight, people in nearby seats who had heard everything, who had not spoken, who had made themselves small, who had looked away. He thought about the woman who had been pretending to sleep. He thought about Kevin Marsh and the carpet. He thought about all the times in his life that the people who knew something was wrong had chosen the calculation of silence over the cost of speaking. He thought about Elena Vasquez, who had stepped forward and been stopped, and who had looked at him with the face of someone who had not yet found their moment, but was still looking for it. He reached into his duffel. He pulled out the secondary phone, encrypted high frequency, used only for directives that required the level of security and directness that a standard cell call could not provide. He powered it on. He watched the screen illuminate in the dim terminal light. He thought about his father. He thought about Howard Durrell. He thought about Amara asleep in Chicago, who deserved to grow up in a world that was a few degrees less willing to see her the way this terminal had seen him tonight. He found Darius Cole's number. His thumb hovered. "Not yet," he said to himself quietly. Then he looked at the rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked at the departure board cycling above him, all those cities, all those flights, all that motion. Then he dialed. Darius picked up in one ring. He always did. Marcus said, "It's me." Darius said, "I know." There was a particular quality to the silence that followed on Darius's end. Not hesitation, not surprise, just the focused quiet of a man who has learned to read Marcus Webb's silences the way other people read facial expressions. The quality of this silence, the specific weight of the two words Marcus had said, told Darius something before Marcus had said anything further. "Talk to me," Darius said. And Marcus talked. He spoke for 4 minutes and 20 seconds without interruption, calmly, in order with the same precise sequential language he used in acquisition briefings. He described the boarding. He described Diane Crowley. He described Captain Pelham and the word son. He described the Port Authority escort down Concourse C and the particular quality of Bryce Holton's announcement at the gate desk. He described the feeling which he did not usually describe to anyone of walking through a terminal at night, surrounded by uniformed officers while strangers watched. Darius listened through all of it without speaking. On the other end of the line in his apartment in Chicago, Marcus could hear the specific sound of Darius sitting very still. When Darius was processing something that required a significant response, he went completely still in a way that was audible over a phone line if you knew him well enough. When Marcus finished, there was a beat of silence. Then Darius said, "When do you want it?" 4 words. The precision of them, not what do you need or what do you want me to do, but the specific forward-looking when, was the reason Marcus had hired Darius 9 years ago and had not once reconsidered the decision. 10 minutes, Marcus said. Personnel files. Diane Crowley, Captain Arthur Pelham, Bryce Holton, Gate Supervisor, Concourse C, Portland International. Elevate Airways, HR, records full and unredacted. Passenger manifest for Flight 219, full, specifically the woman in Seat 4B. A pause. Legal team on standby. Not activated, just available. I want them reachable. Another pause. Emergency board call 7 a.m. Chicago. In person, not video. And Darius, yeah, move the acquisition announcement. Monday to Sunday, Sunrise Edition. A beat. Done, Darius said. Then, are you okay? Marcus looked at the rain on the glass. He looked at the departure board above him. All those cities, all that motion, all those flights going somewhere indifferent to what was happening in this particular plastic chair. I'm fine, he said. He called Priya Okafor next. She picked up on the 3rd ring, her voice alert in the way of someone who was already awake and had been waiting for something, though she didn't know exactly what. Marcus. I saw your name on the manifest earlier. I almost flagged it for VIP handling, and then I thought, no, if he wanted that, he'd have said so. A pause. Is everything all right? No, Marcus said, and he told her. By the 2nd minute of his account, he could hear Priya moving, the sound of her standing up from wherever she was sitting, the quick footstep of a woman reconfiguring herself for action. When he finished, there was a silence that lasted approximately 2 seconds, which was as long as Priya Okafor had ever been known to take before reaching a decision. "I'm so sorry, Marcus. Tell me what you need." "Here's what I need," he said. He outlined the Gate K9 plan. He explained the importance of containment, not for his sake, but for the integrity of what was about to happen. He didn't want this unfolding in a public concourse in front of hundreds of connecting passengers. He wanted it witnessed by the people who had been on that plane. He wanted the crew who had made these decisions to face the consequences of those decisions in front of the same audience that had watched them make them. Priya said, "I'll have HR, corporate, legal, and security on the jet bridge when they land. Gate K9 will be prepped. Ground crew will reroute them on approach. Standard congestion protocol. Nothing flagged." Another pause. "Marcus, I'm going to need Elena Vasquez's personnel file before I land. Something tells me we're going to want to know who she is." "You're ahead of me," he said. "I usually am," she said. Then, quietly, "Get to the signature terminal. Your aircraft is ready." He hung up. He sat for a moment longer in the plastic chair near Gate C4. He looked at the rain. He thought briefly of his father driving home from the bank on a Tuesday in March with his hands on the wheel and his face composed and everything intact that was supposed to be intact. "Build around it," he said to no one. He picked up his duffel. He stood. He walked toward the private aviation exit without looking back at Gate C7, where Flight 219 was currently pushing back from the jetway. Its crew satisfied, its senior passenger settled into her sparkling wine, its captain already composing in his head the story he would tell tomorrow about the decisive call he had made tonight. Marcus Webb walked through Portland International Airport for the last time that evening, as a man who had just been publicly removed from his own airline, and he walked the way his father had walked out of that bank. With everything intact that was supposed to be intact, and a plan already forming for what came next. I need to pause right here, just for a second, because Marcus Webb is about to board a private jet and beat a commercial flight to Chicago. He is going to be in that building, in that gate, before the crew of Flight 219 even begins their descent. And everything he is about to do, he is going to do completely calmly, without raising his voice once. I want to ask you something before we get there. Have you ever had a moment where you had every right to explode, and instead you stayed quiet and let the other person finish and trusted that the truth would land harder than any argument you could make, because that is what Marcus Webb just did on that jet bridge? Comment below. Tell me if you could have held it together. Subscribe if you haven't. Share this one. You're going to want to see how this ends. The signature flight support facility at Portland International sat on the south end of the airfield, separated from the commercial terminal by a stretch of tarmac that might as well have been a different planet. No departure boards, no crowded concourses, no baggage carousels, and no fluorescent-lit corridors smelling of fast food and delayed flights. Just a glass and steel facility with diffused lighting and the quiet efficiency of a place that understood exactly who it was serving. A ground crew member in a yellow vest was waiting at the entrance with an umbrella. He held it over Marcus's head without being asked. Marcus thanked him and kept walking. The Gulfstream, Bay 5. O sat on the private tarmac with its stairs already lowered and its interior lights warm against the wet dark. Marcus climbed the stairs, ducked through the door, and the world of Portland International Airport disappeared behind him. The cabin was 10 seats, a mahogany conference table, cream leather, and the specific kind of quiet that very expensive aircraft have. Not silence exactly, but the absence of intrusion. A flight attendant offered a hot towel and sparkling water. He accepted both. He sat at the conference table and opened his encrypted laptop. He looked at the screen for a moment without typing anything. Then he opened the secure conference line. By the time the Gulfstream had taxied to the runway, 4 faces were on his screen. Darius Cole in his apartment in Chicago had changed into a suit jacket over a dress shirt. This was Darius's signal that something real was happening. He wore casual clothes to strategy discussions. He wore a suit jacket when decisions were being made. Priya Okafor, in the back of a car moving through Chicago, looked the way people look when they are angry on someone else's behalf. A particular expression Marcus associated with competence and integrity. She had her tablet open and was already reading. Jonathan Marsh, no relation to Kevin, a fact Marcus noted and allowed himself a single dry thought about, was the senior partner at Caldwell Finch and Reyes, the corporate law firm retained by Webb and Hargrove. He was 56, white-haired, in the silver way of men who have spent 3 decades making other people's problems their problem, and he had the specific calmness of someone who has been woken up at midnight before and has learned that the quality of his thinking doesn't suffer from it. And Darius had added a fourth face. Carol Reston Elevate Airways' Director of Human Resources on her laptop at her kitchen table in a bathrobe that she had clearly forgotten she was wearing. She was the person who would be executing whatever was decided tonight, and Darius had understood that having her present was more efficient than briefing her later. "Personnel files are in your inbox," Darius said before Marcus had spoken. "I flagged the 3 items you'll want to address first." Marcus opened the files. He read in silence for 40 seconds. No one on the call spoke. "Diane Crowley," he said finally. 4 prior complaints. Passengers, not crew. 2 of them specifically identify race." He paused. "All 4 reviewed and dismissed by the same regional director, Frank Odom." He looked at Darius. "Odom retired 14 months ago," Darius said. "I pulled his departure file. He left under a standard retirement package, no flags. But the timeline of those complaint dismissals, all 4 within 48 hours of receipt, all signed off by Odom personally, is not accidental. It's a pattern embedded in a structure. Someone built that in. Include Odom in the audit scope," Marcus said. "Full review of everything he touched in the 18 months before retirement." "Already drafted," Darius said. Jonathan spoke next. "Captain Pelham. 3 formal write-ups from first officers all citing aggressive conduct toward passengers. 1 FAA protocol review in 2019. He removed a passenger from an aircraft in Phoenix. The review was closed without action because he had 28 years of seniority at the time and the union weighed in." Jonathan paused. "Tonight's incident, documented on aircraft audio and witnessed by a retired federal judge, constitutes a pattern of conduct under Section 12C of the pilot's conduct agreement. The union cannot protect him from a pattern finding. They know it. We've sent them the audio. They've already indicated they won't contest." "Bryce Holton," Darius said. "Clean file." "Which means," Marcus said. "Which means no one ever formally complained. Which means the behavior was considered acceptable, or the people who witnessed it calculated that speaking up would cost more than staying quiet." Darius looked at him through the screen. "James Whitfield filed a written statement 40 minutes ago. Signed, dated verbatim quote of what Holton said at the gate desk, time-stamped with a note on the number of public witnesses present." Marcus absorbed this. A retired federal judge filed a statement 40 minutes after the incident. 22 years on the Oregon federal bench, Darius confirmed. For the first time since he sat in seat 2, Marcus allowed something that was not quite a smile to arrive on his face. It was brief. It was the expression of a man who has spent his career watching the world reveal itself, and who has learned to recognize the particular shape of justice finding its own architecture. "The woman in seat 4. B," Marcus said. Margaret Ashworth, Darius said. CEO of Ashworth Supply Company, Naperville, Illinois. Regional catering and linen vendor for Elevate Airways. Signed a 2-year contract last March. A pause. "The contract covers our Midwestern hubs. Indianapolis, Milwaukee, St. Louis. Value $4.2 million over the term. It represents approximately 58% of Ashworth Supply Company's total annual revenue." The conference table cabin was very quiet except for the sound of the Gulfstream's engines carrying them east through the dark. "She's our vendor," Marcus said. "She's your vendor," Darius said. "She has been for 8 months. And she was on the vendor review call last February. She didn't know who she was talking to. The acquisition wasn't public. But she was briefed by our operations team, and she signed off on the contract that week. Her largest client, your airline. Jonathan pulled up the vendor agreement on his screen. Section 11B, Morals and Corporate Conduct Clause. Standard language we added to all vendor agreements post-acquisition. Any vendor whose key executives engage in conduct that contradicts, elevates public values, or brings the airline into public disrepute constitutes material breach. The clause is airtight. We wrote it to be. Draft the termination notice, Marcus said. Courier to Ashworth Supply Company's corporate office, Monday before noon. Done, Jonathan said. Priya spoke for the first time since the call began. She had been reading absorbing, and Marcus had let her do it because he knew that Priya's silence was the silence of someone synthesizing rather than the silence of someone disengaged. Marcus, I want to say something about Elena Vasquez. Tell me. She filed an internal ethics report at 10:11 p.m., 40 minutes before I landed. Before she knew about any of this. Before she knew who you were or what was about to happen. She reported what she saw because she saw it was wrong. Priya paused. I want to make sure that's not lost in everything else that's happening tonight. Marcus looked at the screen. It won't be, he said. Make sure she knows that. He closed the personnel files. He opened the flight tracker on his secondary screen. His Gulfstream was somewhere over Idaho, descending toward the upper Midwest. Flight 219 was still over eastern Oregon, cruising at 35,000 feet. Its crew feeling the particular settled satisfaction of people who believe they have handled a situation correctly. They had 40 minutes before Chicago. They would not land together. Marcus would be at Gate K9 before Flight 219 began its approach. He thought about Captain Pelham in the cockpit up there, satisfied with his 31 years of seniority and the decision he had made about the man in 2A. He thought about Diane Crowley in the galley, pouring Peggy Ashworth a complimentary glass of wine with the warm conspiratorial smile of a woman who has done a good deed and is enjoying the recognition. He thought about Bryce Holton at his gate counter in Portland, already composing the version of tonight he would tell. He leaned back in his leather seat. He sipped his sparkling water. He watched the flight tracker. Let them land, he said to no one in the cabin. Let them think they won. The dossier on Margaret Ashworth was 34 pages. Thorough in the way that Darius's research was always thorough, which meant complete, organized, and ruthlessly relevant. She had founded Ashworth Supply Company at 39 after 15 years as a regional sales manager for a food distribution company in Illinois. She had started with a 2,000-square-foot warehouse in Naperville, 2 delivery trucks, and 1 client. A small regional hotel chain that she had serviced in her previous role. She had built from there with the particular tenacity of someone who is motivated in equal parts by ambition and the profound need to prove that she could do what people had told her was unlikely. She was good at her business. She was genuinely good at it. Her logistics systems were efficient. Her client retention rate over 15 years was 88%. Her employees stayed. She was not a simple person. Marcus had understood this from the moment Darius first read out her name, and he had spent the descent making sure he continued to understand it. Because the people who do the most damage in these situations are rarely the simple ones. The simple ones are easy. The complex ones, the ones who have built something real and have convinced themselves that the building of it validates everything else about them, those are the ones who deserve the full weight of genuine accounting. Peggy Ashworth had not walked onto that plane intending to destroy anything. She had looked at a black man in a hoodie sitting in a first-class seat studying a technical document, and she had done what she had been doing her entire life. She had trusted her instincts absolutely without question, without the discipline of examining what those instincts were built on. Her instincts were built on 58 years of a particular kind of certainty. The certainty that her read of a room was accurate. The certainty that certain combinations of appearance and context added up to certain conclusions. The certainty that speaking up, pressing the call button, leaning toward the flight attendant saying, "I don't feel safe," was a form of civic virtue, rather than a form of harm. She had built a $4 million a year revenue stream on the foundation of a company she didn't know she was working for. She had been on the vendor review call. She had spoken to the Webb and Hargrove operations team for 40 minutes. She had signed a contract that contained on page 38 Section 11B language that she had presumably read and presumably understood, and certainly had not considered in the context of an airplane seat and a man in a gray hoodie. The operational impact of the contract termination on Ashworth Supply Company was not something Marcus approached lightly. Darius had included the employment breakdown in the file: 340 employees, the majority of them in the Midwest, earning wages that were in the middle of the regional distribution for their roles. The three affected hubs, Indianapolis, Milwaukee, St. Louis, represented the core of the company's operational infrastructure. Losing 58% of revenue would not be a setback. It would be a structural crisis. Marcus read all of this. He held it in the same mental space as everything else. And he reached the same conclusion he always reached when consequence and complexity arrived. Together, the consequence had to be real. If the people who had authority adjusted their behavior only when the cost of not doing so was purely theoretical, nothing changed. The cost had to be actual. There was a difference, he had told his daughter 6 months ago when she called from school, between shrinking and choosing. You did not shrink, but you also did not destroy for the pleasure of it. You made the consequence real, and you made it proportional, and you made it clear enough that the lesson could be read. The contract termination was proportional. He had reviewed the morals clause 3 times. It was exactly what it said it was. He would not be invoking the public disclosure provision. The last item in Peggy's file was a note that Darius had added in his own hand, the only item not generated by a database or a document review. It said, "On the vendor review call, February 14th, after signing the paperwork, she told the operations team, 'I just love working with people who actually know how to run things. The recording is archived.'" Marcus read this. He set down the file. He looked out the window at the Chicago grid below. He thought about the recording. He thought about the 340 employees. He thought about the pearls and the sparkling wine and the particular texture of Peggy Ashworth's conviction, the speed and ease of it, the total absence of hesitation. He thought about what he was going to say to her when he saw her on that aircraft. Not much. That was the thing he had learned. The thing his father had known, and Howard had refined, and 19 years of boardrooms had confirmed. The people who deserve a reckoning are most powerfully met with economy, with the minimum number of words necessary to make the truth absolutely clear, with the specific quiet authority of a man who does not need to be loud to be heard. He closed the file. The Gulfstream was on final approach. The runway lights were below. Somewhere above, still descending through the cloud layer, Flight 219 was 8 minutes behind. At that exact moment, in the rear galley of Flight 219, Elena Vasquez was sitting on a jump seat with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she had poured 12 minutes ago and not drunk. Kevin Marsh was in the forward galley watching something on his phone. Diane was at the front of the cabin talking with Peggy Ashworth in the low, warm register of 2 people who have decided they are on the same side of something. Elena looked at her phone. She opened her email. She pulled up the sent folder. She found the message, time-stamped 10:11 p.m., and read it back to herself. The careful, specific language she had used, the exact details she had included, the way she had described what she had heard Diane say, and what she had observed Pelham do, and the moment she had stepped forward and been stopped. She read it all the way through. She exhaled. She did not feel relief. She felt the particular kind of fear that accompanies doing something that cannot be undone. The sharp, clear fear of a person who has just changed the trajectory of their own life and doesn't yet know where it lands. But underneath the fear, underneath the uncertainty, there was something solid, something she recognized from the handful of times in her life when she had made a decision that she knew, even in the fear of it, was right. She put her phone in her pocket. She picked up her coffee. She drank it. Flight 219 began its descent into Chicago. Diane Crowley had been with Elevate Airways for 18 years, and in that time she had developed what she privately considered an excellent instinct for the end of a good flight. The particular way the cabin settled when people began to feel that home was close, the softening of the pre-arrival energy, the zip of overhead bins, and the quiet rustling of people retrieving what they had stowed and reassembling themselves for wherever they were going next. This flight had that quality. She felt it as she moved through the cabin for final approach preparation. The sense of resolution of a situation handled of a professional evening drawing toward its appropriate close. She caught Peggy Ashworth's eye as she passed row 4, and Peggy gave her the small, warm smile of a woman who has decided that the evening had gone exactly as it should have, and Diane returned it with the practiced warmth of someone who has learned to calibrate her expressions to her audience. She stopped at the forward galley and pulled the curtain. Kevin was folding a service napkin with the mechanical attention of someone whose mind was elsewhere. Elena was in the rear. The cabin was quiet. The engines had shifted to their lower landing register, and through the windows, the lights of Chicago were beginning to rise. "Good flight," Diane said to no one in particular. She meant it. In the cockpit, Captain Arthur Pelham was running his final approach checklist with the settled authority of a man who considers a good landing the natural conclusion to a day of good decisions. The night had been handled. The situation had been addressed. The passenger who had created a disruption, who had in Pelham's private reckoning tried to make himself more important than the safety and comfort of the aircraft, had been appropriately removed, and the flight had proceeded without further incident. First Officer Sandra Ortiz, seated to his right, ran her portion of the checklist without comment. She was 38, efficient professional in the way of someone who has learned that her best professional strategy is to keep her head down and do her job correctly. She had heard the confrontation. She had seen Pelham walk down the aisle. She had observed enough to have a clear private opinion about what had happened, which she had kept precisely as private as she had calculated was necessary. She was reading the ground display when the gate assignment changed. "Captain." Her voice was neutral, careful. "Ground control is rerouting us. Gate K9. Pelham looked at the display. K9. His voice was flat. "That's the overflow gate. We have first-class passengers with connections." "What's the reason?" Company Directive Sandra said. "Control says the gate is prepped and waiting." Pelham keyed his radio. Ground control confirmed the directive without elaborating. The tone was routine, the practiced neutrality of a controller who has been briefed to maintain routine. Pelham grumbled. He steered. He was irritated. K9 was far from the main terminal's poorly lit a maintenance area gate that he associated with equipment issues and operational disruptions, not with flights he considered to have gone smoothly. Probably a congestion issue, he said to Sandra, or possibly to himself. Sandra looked at the ground display. She said nothing. At 30 feet altitude, Sandra Ortiz saw the first of the SUVs. She said carefully, "Captain." The gate area. Pelham was focused on the flare. He brought the 737 down with the smooth authority of 31 years of muscle memory, tires screeching against the wet Chicago tarmac, thrust reversers engaging the long, controlled deceleration of a large aircraft returning to Earth. It was a good landing. He engaged the taxi sequence and turned toward the K9 corridor, and that was when he saw them. The cluster of black vehicles, the figures in suits under the floodlights, the particular configuration of people assembled at a maintenance gate at midnight that did not look like any congestion issue he had ever seen. His hands tightened slightly on the controls. "What the hell is going on out there?" Sandra said. "I don't know, Captain." She did not elaborate. She watched the gate approach with the expression of a woman who does know and who has decided that knowing is not the same as saying. The aircraft came to rest. The engines cycled down. The seatbelt sign chimed off. The cabin immediately became the familiar organized chaos of arrival. People standing bins opening the shuffle and zip of 47 passengers retrieving their belongings and beginning to become again individuals rather than cargo. Diane moved to the forward door. She peered through the small circular window. She expected the standard arrival configuration: a jet bridge, a ramp agent, the ground crew with their wands and their noise-canceling headsets. She saw instead a jet bridge with people in it who were moving toward the aircraft at a speed that suggested intention rather than preparation. She straightened. She smoothed her uniform. She pinned on her best arrival smile. The door mechanism engaged from the outside. The door swung open, and Priya Okafor stepped onto the aircraft. Diane's smile faltered by 1 millimeter. She had seen Priya's photograph in the Elevate Airways newsletter. The new CEO announcement 4 days ago, a profile photograph in which Priya had looked composed and warm, and exactly the kind of leader a corporate newsletter would choose to introduce. She looked different in person. She looked like someone who had been briefed and had decided and was executing a decision with the precision of a woman who did not make imprecise decisions. Behind her were 2 HR representatives with manila folders. Behind them, corporate security, Miss Crowley Priya said. Her voice was not loud. It was the voice of someone who has learned that authority does not require volume. Diane's smile completed its collapse. Ms. Okafor, I wasn't aware of a scheduled. I need your crew, ID your service tablet, and your manual. Priya looked at her with the direct attention of someone who has already accounted for every possible response to what they are about to say and has found all of them workable. You are relieved of duty, effective immediately. The words landed in the first-class cabin with the weight of something dropped from a height. Diane's mouth opened. Relieved of duty. Ms. Okafor, I just secured this flight. I protected the safety of every passenger on this aircraft from a potential. You racially profiled a ticketed passenger, Miss Crowley. Priya's voice did not rise. It did not need to. You violated 4 separate crew conduct protocols. The aircraft's cabin audio, which you are required by FAA regulation to know, has been active throughout this flight, captured your exact language, including your statement to the passenger in seat 2A about how people in the premium cabin generally look a certain way. The cabin had gone very still. Passengers who had been in motion had stopped being in motion. Hands that had been pulling bags from overhead bins were holding those bags without moving. Terminated, she said. The word came out different from the way it had sounded in her head. Smaller. Yes, Priya said. At that moment, Captain Pelham burst through the cockpit door. Captain Arthur Pelham came through the cockpit door with the energy of a man whose authority is being violated in his own house, and he stopped dead when he saw Priya Okafor standing at the forward door of his aircraft in a charcoal blazer flanked by corporate representatives. What is the meaning of this? His voice boomed automatically, the voice of a man who has spent 31 years being the loudest authority in every room he entered, who authorized boarding before the passengers have deplaned. Pelham stopped dead when he saw her. Ms. Okafor, he said. Captain Pelham Priya said with the exact same tone she had used with Diane, even and precise. You are suspended from command, effective immediately. Please step off the aircraft. Union representatives are waiting in the terminal. You will be submitting to a disciplinary hearing for gross negligence and passenger rights violations. Violations? Pelham's face reddened. The word hit his ego before it reached his reasoning. I removed a hostile passenger from my aircraft using the authority vested in me by FAA regulations and airline protocol. I have the full right to remove any individual I deem a safety risk. You removed a passenger who had done nothing, Priya said. You did so based on a crew member's report that was itself based on a passenger complaint that contained no factual basis for a security concern. The cabin audio confirms the sequence. The passenger manifest confirms the passenger's conduct. She paused. The union has reviewed the audio and the 2019 FAA violation documentation. They have formally declined to contest this suspension. Pelham's chin came up. The union has declined to contest? Priya repeated. Cleanly, finitely. The word union and what followed it reached Pelham like a physical blow. He looked at Carol Reston, the HR director who stepped forward from the group near the galley with the thick personnel action folder. He looked at the folder. He looked at Priya. He looked at Diane, who had gone a specific shade of pale that contained within it the full dawning of her situation. The cabin was absolutely silent. Not the pre-departure hush of people settling in or the mid-flight lull of people tired. The complete suspended silence of people who have stopped being passengers and have become witnesses. And then, from the jet bridge, they heard footsteps. Not the footsteps of a gate agent or a ground crew member. Deliberate footsteps. The footsteps of a man who knows exactly where he is going and is in no hurry about it because hurry implies urgency, and urgency implies a situation that is uncertain, and this situation from Marcus Webb's perspective had stopped being uncertain approximately 4 hours ago. The executives who had gathered near the galley stepped aside. Marcus walked through the aircraft door in a bespoke charcoal gray Brioni suit. He had changed on the Gulfstream. His shoes made almost no sound on the cabin carpet. His face was arranged in the expression of a man who has not been angry this evening and does not intend to start now. He walked to the front of the first-class cabin and stopped. He looked at Diane Crowley, who was standing with her hand over her mouth, her crew ID still clipped to her lapel, her face the face of a woman who has just understood the full distance between where she was 40 minutes ago and where she is now. He looked at Captain Pelham, who was staring at Marcus with an expression that moved in real time through several stages, the last of which was the specific gray pallor of a man who recognizes too late an error of catastrophic proportion. Marcus said Captain Pelham. Miss Crowley. His voice was quiet enough that people in the rear of the cabin had to be still to hear it. In Portland, I advised you to look up my name in the Elevate Airways corporate registry. You chose not to. A pause. Allow me to complete the introduction properly. My name is Marcus Durrell Webb. I am the founder of Webb and Hargrove Capital Group. As of 72 hours ago, my firm holds a 71% controlling stake in this airline. He let that settle. The uniform you are wearing, the seat you flew in, the aircraft you just landed. All of it operates under the authority of a company I built. The silence in the cabin was the kind that follows something that cannot be taken back. Pelham's face had moved from gray to something that had no good name. He looked at the tailored suit, the absolute composure, the way Priya Okafor stood slightly behind and to the left of Marcus in the exact posture of a CEO in the presence of her principal. And 31 years of reading authority told him finally and completely, and without any possibility of revision, exactly what he had done. You, Pelham started. I gave you the opportunity to check, Marcus said. You chose not to. That choice is documented. He looked at Diane. I want to be clear about something. I am not here because of my title. I am here because of what would have happened to anyone in Seat 2A tonight who did not have the resources to respond the way I have. Because the person in that seat without my resources, the person who matched your instincts just as completely but who didn't own the airline, that person would have simply been removed and forgotten. His voice did not rise. That is the thing I cannot accept. A voice came from the aisle near row 4. Clear carrying. I want to say something. Elena Vasquez stepped out from the rear galley doorway. She was not trembling. Her voice was the voice of someone who has spent the flight finding the ground beneath her feet and has now found it. I filed an internal ethics report at 10:11 p.m. tonight, before this flight landed, before I knew who Mr. Webb was or what was going to happen. She looked at Diane, then at Pelham, then at Marcus. What happened on this aircraft was wrong. I knew it when it was happening. I should have said more. I'm saying it now. Marcus turned to look at her. Your name, Elena Vasquez, Ms. Vasquez. A pause. You will receive a formal commendation, and Priya will be speaking with you about a different role with this company. He looked at Priya, who gave a small nod. Pelham made one more attempt. It was the attempt of a man running on the last fumes of a worldview that was no longer viable, and it revealed him completely. How are we supposed to know? He said. You didn't identify yourself. You came on dressed like... You could have said something. That's not fair. Marcus looked at him. The look was not angry. It was the look of someone who has heard this argument before in many forms over many years, and who has decided that this is not the moment to have it, that the argument itself is part of what needs to be rejected. You were not supposed to need to know, Marcus said. That is the entire point. Pelham had nothing left. Diane had gone very quiet. She had been trying to compose herself since Priya's first sentence, and she was not succeeding, and the failure of it, the tears that she would have described as unfair and that were actually precisely proportional, were visible now. She looked at Marcus and said, Mr. Webb, please. I have a family. I have a mortgage. I've worked for this company for 18 years. I made a mistake. I can see that now. I can. But please. It was not a mistake, Marcus said. His voice when he said it was not harsh. It was something more difficult than harsh. It was clear. A mistake is something that happens when information is absent. You had information. You had a valid boarding pass. You had a calm, cooperative passenger. You had a colleague telling you the reservation was correct. He looked at her steadily. You made a choice. And the choices we make define the standard we have set for everyone who comes after us. Security escort them from the aircraft. 2 large corporate security officers flanked Pelham and Diane, gently but firmly guiding them down the aisle and out the door into the harsh glare of the maintenance gate lights. In seat 1C, James Whitfield had been sitting with his hands folded and his posture absolutely straight since Marcus walked on. He was 67 years old, and he had spent 22 years distinguishing between the performance of justice and the substance of it. He had seen both from the bench and before it and after it, and he had developed what he considered a reliable sense for the difference. He said into the quiet of the cabin, I've spent 22 years on the federal bench. I've seen a great many things. What happened on this aircraft tonight, from the gate in Portland to this moment, is something I will be writing about for a long time. He was right about that. The cabin of Flight 219, once Pelham and Diane had been escorted through the jet bridge door, underwent a change that was not dramatic but was total. The way a room changes when pressure that has been building for an hour is finally actually released. Not chaos, not noise. Something quieter and more significant than either. People began to breathe differently. Tyler from 4D, who had been rigid in his seat since Portland, exhaled audibly and set his phone face down on his knee. A woman in row 5, who had kept her face angled toward the window for the entire flight, turned and looked at the front of the cabin with the expression of someone who has been holding a breath and is deciding whether to believe it is safe to let it go. Kevin Marsh was still against the galley wall. He looked at Marcus, who looked back at him, not with accusation, with assessment, and Kevin dropped his eyes. He had something to say, and he would say it eventually to the HR representative who would call him on Monday, and what he said would be accurate, and it would be too late, and it would not undo anything which was its own kind of education. Marcus looked around the cabin. He did not rush what happened next. He had learned over 19 years of handling difficult moments that the instinct to fill silence immediately was an instinct worth resisting. He let the room breathe. He let the moment be what it was. Then he spoke, not loudly, not in the register of someone making an announcement, but in the register of someone talking to people he is in a room with, directly without performance. I want to tell you why I fly commercial when I evaluate a new acquisition. He looked around the cabin, at the woman in row 5, at James Whitfield, at Tyler, with his phone face down, at the couple in row 3 who had been holding hands since Diane walked out. It isn't theater. It isn't a test. It's because every person in these seats, every seat from the back to the front, is the person this company is supposed to serve. Not serve when they've proven themselves. Not serve when they look a certain way. Serve. Full stop. Tonight you watched what happens when that breaks down. A pause. You also watched what happens when people choose accountability over cover. That is not a common thing. It should be. He turned to look at Elena, who was standing near the rear galley entrance, with her hands at her sides and the particular stillness of someone who is trying to be present for something without drawing attention to their own presence in it. Ms. Vasquez. She looked at him. What you did tonight, before any of this, took more courage than anything that happened in a boardroom. I want you to know I understand the difference. Elena nodded once. Her eyes were bright in a way that she was working to manage, and she was succeeding mostly. Marcus moved to the galley where Priya was standing. They spoke in low, quick sentences, the compressed efficiency of two people who have worked through the architecture of a plan together and are now checking that the execution matches the design. Reform package timing, Marcus said. Board sees it Monday. Internal rollout begins Wednesday. Third-party training firm is already briefed. They've done this before they're good. The anonymous reporting channel will be live in 30 days. Priya paused. I added something. Tell me. Passenger Advocacy Office. External to the airline quarterly review of all closed complaints. Not just looking forward. Reviewing the last 3 years' closure files. She looked at him. If there are more Frank Odoms in the history of this company, I want to find them. Marcus held her gaze for a moment. That's right, he said. That's exactly right. He moved back into the cabin. He addressed it once more. The full cabin, everyone remaining. Customer service representatives are waiting in the terminal. Every passenger on this flight will receive a full refund for tonight's ticket and a travel credit for future use. If you missed a connection, our team will rebook you at company expense and arrange accommodations for tonight. Not a form email, a phone call, from a person. He paused. I apologize for the experience you had tonight, and I intend to make sure it is not repeated. The response was not applause. It was something that required more honesty than applause. A kind of collective stillness, a held attention, the expression of people who are absorbing something real. In seat 1, C, James Whitfield stood. He moved into the aisle with the unhurried dignity of a man who has decided to do something and does not need anyone's attention to do it. He stopped beside Marcus. He was 2 inches shorter and 30 years older, and he looked at the man beside him with an expression that was not sentimental but was something that required sentiment to name. Before I leave, he said quietly, I want to tell you something. Your father was Raymond Webb, mathematics teacher from Detroit. Marcus looked at him. He was in my courtroom once, 2004. Property dispute? A landlord trying to push him out of the space where he was running his print shop. I ruled in his favor. He thanked me afterward in the hallway, very briefly, no theater about it. Whitfield paused. He had a particular quality, the kind that doesn't announce itself. He looked at Marcus. I recognize it. Marcus was quiet for a moment. The fluorescent lights of Gate K9 cast their flat illumination through the aircraft windows. The rain had stopped sometime in the last hour, though he hadn't noticed when. Thank you, sir, he said. The words were simple, and he meant every syllable of them. Whitfield nodded. He picked up his worn paperback from seat 1C, tucked it under his arm, and walked off the aircraft with the same measured pace he had maintained the entire evening, the pace of a man who has been a witness to something important and intends to remain a worthy one. The passengers began to move, one by one, then in clusters, then in the full flow of deplaning. The woman in row 5 paused beside Marcus as she passed and said, I heard what was happening in Portland, and I didn't say anything. I want you to know I'm sorry for that. She kept walking before he could respond, which was its own kind of dignity. Tyler from 4D stopped beside him. He held up his phone, not to record, just to show the screen. A tweet. Just watched a man get kicked off his own airline and then come back in a suit to fire the people who kicked him off. I have the video. I need a minute. He looked at Marcus. Is it okay if I post it? Marcus looked at the tweet. He thought about the question. Post the truth, he said. That's all. Tyler nodded and walked off the plane. Priya appeared beside Marcus as the last passengers filed out. The first-class cabin was empty now, all 12 seats hollow and still, the overhead bins hanging open. The cabin audio still running in its quiet, invisible way above them. "How are you?" she asked. It was a simple question. In the context of the evening, of the past 4 hours, of the specific weight of what Marcus had carried through Portland International and Concourse C and the Gulfstream and Gate K9, it was also the most complex question anyone had asked him all night. "I'm fine," he said. Then after a pause, "I'm going to go home." He picked up his worn black leather duffel from the overhead bin where it had rested untouched since he boarded in Portland. "My daughter's probably awake." Priya walked with him to the jet bridge. They stopped at the top of the ramp. "This airline is going to be better," she said. "I want you to know that I mean that." "I know you mean it," he said. "That's why I hired you." He walked through the jet bridge and into the terminal. The corridors of O'Hare at midnight were quieter than Portland had been. Or perhaps it was that the quality of his movement through them had changed something having been set down that he hadn't fully registered he was carrying. He walked through this terminal. He found the exit. He found his car. He took out his phone. He called home. Amara picked up on the second ring. "Dad, it's midnight." "I know," he said. "I'm on my way home. I have something to tell you." "What happened?" "Something that took a long time to happen," he said. "And something you should know about. I'll explain when I get there." A pause. "Then, are you okay?" Marcus looked through the car window at the wet Chicago streets, reflecting the streetlights back up at themselves. All that doubled light, all that ordinary beauty of a city that doesn't know anything about what just happened, and doesn't need to. He looked at it the way his father had looked at the street outside the bank on the drive home. With everything intact that was supposed to be intact, with the knowledge that what happened tonight was not the end of something, it was the beginning of a correction. "Yes," he said, "I'm okay." He meant it. The first-class cabin had emptied around Peggy Ashworth like water pulling back from a shore. She had watched the passengers deplane in ones and twos, had watched the corporate representatives confer near the galley, had watched Marcus speak and Elena step forward and James Whitfield stand and make his quiet exit. She had watched all of it from seat 4B, where she had been sitting since Portland, and she had not moved. Her carry-on was still in the overhead bin. Her sparkling wine glass, the complimentary one, the one Diane had brought her with the warm conspiratorial nod, was on the tray table, one sip remaining in the bottom of it gone warm. She was holding her handbag against her chest with both hands. The pearls at her throat caught the overhead light. They were the same pearls she had worn every time she signed a significant business agreement in the last 15 years. A habit she had developed, a kind of private ritual, the conviction that they brought clarity and confidence to important moments. They felt different now. She noticed that they felt different, and then she noticed that she was noticing it. And the noticing of the noticing was its own particular kind of discomfort. Marcus walked back down the aisle toward her. He did not rush. There was nothing in his movement that suggested satisfaction or eagerness. He was simply a man moving through a space he owned, covering the distance between the front of a cabin and seat 4B with the same patient, unhurried pace he had used all evening. He stopped adjacent to her row. He looked at her. Peggy's voice came out before she could organize it properly. "Mr. Webb, I want you to know that I had absolutely no idea." "I know you didn't," Marcus said. "That's the part I'd like to talk about." She stopped. He looked at her with a directness that was not angry and was not forgiving. It was simply complete, the directness of someone who sees you clearly and has decided to let you know it. "You didn't know who I was. I understand that. What I'd like you to understand is that the fact of not knowing changes nothing about what you did. You saw me in this seat, and you made a decision about me before I had done one single thing, not because of something I did, because of what I looked like." Peggy's hands tightened on her handbag. "I saw the diagram on your screen looked like..." You saw a technical document on a tablet, Marcus said. You did not know what it was. Instead of asking, instead of simply letting it be what it was, you told a flight attendant that you didn't feel safe. A pause. You used words that set in motion everything that happened in the next 2 hours, and you used them about a person who was sitting in silence doing his work. She had been prepared somewhere in the back of her mind for anger. Anger she would have known how to handle. She had handled difficult confrontations before in business negotiations and complicated vendor conversations in the 15 years of building a company that had required her to be tougher than people expected. Anger was a shape she recognized. This was not anger. This was something that required more from her than anger did. "I made a mistake," she said. Her voice was smaller than she intended it to be. "You made a choice," Marcus said. Not cruelly, clearly. "There's a distinction that matters." He held her gaze for a moment. "Mrs. Ashworth. I know who you are. I know what your company does. I know what this contract means to you and to the people who work for you." The sentence landed with precision. Her breath changed. "You've been a vendor for Elevate Airways for 8 months," Marcus continued. "The contract was countersigned by my firm. Your largest client, the revenue that represents the majority of your company's business, is built on a foundation that I created. And tonight you sat 4 rows behind me on a plane I own and pointed at me as a threat." Peggy's hands were shaking. She could feel them shaking against the leather of her bag, and she could not make them stop. "The contract," she started. "Ashworth Supply Company will receive a termination notice Monday morning," Marcus said. "Section 11B of your vendor agreement, the Morals and Corporate Conduct Clause. It was on page 38. You signed it." She closed her eyes, opened them. When she spoke, the composure she had maintained since Portland, the particular composure of a woman who has spent her life believing her instincts were her greatest asset, was gone. What was left was something much smaller and more honest. "If you pull this contract, Marcus, Mr. Webb, my people, 340 people, they have nothing to do with tonight. They're just—" "I know," Marcus said. "I reviewed the file. 340 employees, Midwestern hubs, 2 years' worth of operational interdependence." He looked at her. "I know the numbers. That is my job." He reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved an envelope. Cream-colored sealed the Elevate Airways corporate seal embossed on the upper left corner. "The Morals Clause exists for a reason. It is there because the actions of leadership reflect on the institution. Tonight, in a public setting witnessed by multiple people recorded on aircraft audio, you made a choice that reflects on every vendor relationship Elevate Airways has." He held out the envelope. She looked at it. She looked at it the way you look at something you have brought entirely upon yourself, and cannot dispute and cannot escape and cannot pretend you didn't see coming once you are honest about how you got here. She took it. Marcus looked at her for one more moment. Not with triumph, not with contempt. With the specific quiet sadness of a man who has had to do something necessary that was not pleasant and who does not confuse necessity with satisfaction. Then he turned and walked back toward the front of the cabin. He did not look back. Peggy Ashworth sat alone in seat 4B of the emptied aircraft. The overhead lights hummed. The pearls caught the light. The envelope lay on the seat beside her unopened. Outside the windows of Gate K9, the Chicago tarmac was wet and dark and entirely indifferent. She picked up the envelope. She held it in both hands for a moment, feeling the weight of it, which was not the weight of paper and legal language, but the weight of an evening that had assembled itself out of one pressed call button and 5 seconds of absolute conviction. She thought about 340 people. She thought about the man who had just walked away. She thought about the moment on the plane when she had pressed the button and felt completely righteously certain. She wondered what that certainty had been made of. She did not have a good answer. Bryce Holton set his alarm for 4:45 a.m. on Monday because his shift started at 6 and he liked to have time to stop for coffee and arrive early, which was one of the things he had always told himself set him apart. He drove to Portland International in the pre-dawn dark with his gate supervisor badge clipped to his jacket lapel, and the quiet, settled satisfaction of a man who believed the previous Thursday night had gone well. He had thought about it over the weekend. In the way that people think about professional moments, they are proud of replaying them privately, polishing the details. He had handled a difficult passenger. He had supported his crew. He had maintained the authority of the position he had worked 7 years to reach. He had, in his private telling of it, been exactly the kind of gate supervisor that the airline needed more of. He stopped for coffee at the shop outside the employee entrance. He nodded to 2 colleagues from the B concourse. He rode the employee elevator to the gate level. He walked down the corridor to the concourse C supervisor station, swiped his badge at the door panel, and the reader blinked red. He tried again. Red. He looked at the panel. He looked at his badge. He tried the secondary door. Red. He went to the main gate desk and used the employee phone to call his direct supervisor. No answer. He tried the regional manager's line. A voice he didn't recognize answered. A woman professional who told him he needed to report to human resources before beginning his shift. She gave him a room number. Bryce stood at the gate desk with the phone in his hand and the first cold needle of something not right moving through his chest. He set the phone down. He walked to HR. Walked to H. The room was a standard meeting space near the administrative offices. 2 chairs across from a table, a window with a view of the employee parking structure. A water pitcher no one had touched. Behind the table sat a regional manager Bryce recognized, and on a laptop screen open to a secure video connection, a woman in Chicago he did not. The woman in Chicago introduced herself. Corporate compliance. She had a calm, organized voice and a folder on the desk in front of her that she opened without ceremony. She told him in sequence what he had said at Gate C7 on Thursday night. She quoted him verbatim. "People like you think a first-class ticket comes with first-class manners." She told him the timestamp. She told him the number of witnesses. The regional manager's office had collected statements from 4. She told him that one of those witnesses was a retired federal judge who had provided a written signed account in the precise language of a man who had spent 22 years producing legal documentation. Then she told him who Marcus Webb was. The silence that followed was not the silence of a man absorbing new information. It was the silence of a man watching the entire architecture of a private narrative collapse. The narrative in which he had been the professional, the decisive one, the person who did what needed to be done. That narrative had been for 4 days entirely intact. It collapsed in approximately 30 seconds. He tried. He explained that he hadn't known. He explained that the captain had already made the call. He explained that he was simply supporting the crew's decision, following protocol, doing his job. Every explanation was accurate in the narrow procedural sense and insufficient in every other sense, which was the nature of explanations offered after the consequences have already arrived. The compliance officer listened to all of it. Then she said, "Your employment with Elevate Airways is terminated effective today, for cause under Section 7C of the conduct agreement you signed at the time of hire. You will receive formal documentation by end of business. Your badge access has been revoked." She closed the folder. Bryce walked out of the meeting room. He walked back through the administrative corridor. He took the employee elevator. He walked through the employee entrance into the Monday morning cold, the coffee in his hand long since gone lukewarm, the badge on his jacket lapel that no longer worked, and a box that someone had quietly prepared and left at the security desk containing a phone charger, a mug with the Elevate Airways logo, and a framed photograph of himself shaking hands with a regional manager at a company awards dinner. Outside, it was raining. Officer Ray Mendoza, arriving for his morning shift, held the door open for someone leaving the employee entrance. He looked at the man walking out with the box. He looked at the badge. He put the pieces together quietly the way he had put pieces together all Friday night. He said nothing. He walked to his post. He thought about the man he had walked through Concourse C, the one who had said thank you and meant it, and who had been right about everything and who had not needed to raise his voice once. He straightened his shoulders. He started his shift. 6 weeks later, Marcus Webb walked through Portland International Airport in a charcoal gray wool hoodie, dark chinos, and white sneakers with a small scuff on the left toe. The worn leather duffel was on his shoulder. The rain had given way to an early Pacific Northwest spring. Tentative sun, the particular clean-washed smell of a city that has been rinsed. And the light through the concourse windows was different from the night he remembered. Everything else was the same. The departure boards, the rolling luggage, the gate numbers in their lit sequence down Concourse C. He walked to Gate C7. The gate agent was a young woman named Sophia, 4 weeks into the job recently through the Elevate Airways onboarding program that Priya Okafor had redesigned from the ground up. She was 23, organized, and possessed of the particular attentiveness of someone who has been told in training that the way you treat a person in the first 10 seconds of contact tells them everything they need to know about whether they are welcome. She scanned Marcus's boarding pass. Her screen showed the quiet, golden indicator of executive status. She looked up. She did not make a performance of the recognition. She simply said, "Welcome back, Mr. Webb. We've been looking forward to having you." She handed back his boarding pass with a clean, genuine smile that contained no calculation, no calibration, no assessment of what his hoodie or his shoes or his carry-on communicated about whether he belonged in the seat he had purchased. Marcus nodded. He walked down the jet bridge. He stepped onto the aircraft. The lead flight attendant greeted him by name, offered to take his jacket, and asked if he wanted still or sparkling water before departure. He took his seat, to a window, and pulled out his tablet. No one whispered. No call button rang. No one walked down the aisle with her chin up to ask whether he had the right to be there. The cabin was just a cabin, the way it had always been supposed to be. Elena Vasquez became the passenger experience lead for Elevate Airways' Pacific Northwest Corridor, the youngest person to hold the role in the airline's history. She did not seek recognition for what she had done on Flight 219, and she did not receive the kind that comes with noise. What she received was a phone call from Priya Okafor on a Sunday morning, and a role that allowed her to spend her days making sure that what had happened on that flight would not happen again. At least, not without consequence, not without someone saying clearly this is wrong, and I will not look away. James Whitfield published a short essay in a legal journal about implicit bias and the cost of institutional silence. It was cited in 3 subsequent federal cases. He did not consider this an accomplishment. He considered it the minimum. Officer Ray Mendoza received a commendation from the Port Authority for professional conduct during the incident. He kept it in his locker rather than his desk because he was not sure he had earned it, and because the uncertainty itself seemed important to preserve. The thing that no one who crossed Marcus Webb that night ever fully understood was that he was never angry. Anger would have been too small for what the moment required. What he felt sitting alone in Terminal C with the rain against the glass and his daughter's voice already forming in his memory was something older and more deliberate. It was the same thing his father had felt on the drive home from the bank in Detroit, and his father's father before that, and every person who has ever been told by the configuration of a room that they do not belong in it. The decision made quietly and kept to build until that room no longer has the power to deliver that message. Not just for yourself, for everyone who comes after you who will sit in that seat and hope simply to get home. That was the call that ended careers. Not the one he made to Darius, the one he made to himself, years ago and every day since, to never stop building until the ceiling became a door. If this story moved you, if you believe that dignity is not a privilege but a right that every person carries into every room they walk into, share this video right now. Send it to someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button. We tell stories like this every single week. Stories about real courage, real justice, and real people who refused to be made small. Drop a comment below and tell me, could you have held it together the way Marcus Webb did on that jet bridge? And don't forget to give this video a like. It helps more people find this story. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.